The jungle did not announce itself. It closed in quietly. Heat pressed down through layers of green so thick that daylight barely reached the ground. Insects never stopped. Rain arrived without warning. And somewhere beyond the tree line, an enemy you could not always see was already moving. This was Guadalcanal, the place where the Pacific War stopped being theoretical and became personal. For the United States Marine Corps, Guadalcanal was not just a battle, it was a beginning. In the summer of 1942, American forces went on the offensive for the first time against Imperial Japan. The goal was limited on paper: seize a half-finished airstrip, deny the enemy control of nearby sea lanes, and hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The reality was far harsher. Guadalcanal would become a fight for survival on land, at sea, and in the air, all at once. The Marines landed with confidence and uncertainty in equal measure. The beaches were taken quickly. The airfield, soon called Henderson Field, was secured. And then the war changed. Supply ships withdrew under threat. Food ran short. Ammunition was counted carefully. What followed was not a steady advance, but a desperate hold. The United States Marine Corps found itself isolated on an island where the enemy controlled the night and the surrounding seas. Each sunset brought expectation of naval bombardment, of infiltration, of attacks launched through darkness and rain. The jungle became an enemy of its own. Diseases weakened entire units. Weapons rusted. Visibility vanished beyond a few yards. Combat was sudden and close. Engagements erupted without warning and ended just as abruptly. Japanese forces attacked relentlessly, often at night, probing Marine lines for weakness. The Marines responded with fire, discipline, and a growing understanding that this war would not resemble anything they had trained for. At sea, the fighting was just as brutal. Iron Bottom Sound filled with wreckage as naval battles raged in darkness. Ships were sunk within sight of shore. Supplies arrived sporadically, sometimes under fire, sometimes not at all. The fate of the men on the island depended on battles fought beyond the horizon. Guadalcanal became a test of endurance, not of speed, not of maneuver, but of will. Men fought while exhausted. They fought while hungry. They fought knowing relief might not come in time. And yet, the line held. Slowly, painfully, the balance shifted. Reinforcements arrived. Air superiority grew. Japanese attacks lost strength. What began as a fragile foothold hardened into a position the enemy could no longer break. When Guadalcanal finally ended, it did not feel like victory. It felt like survival. The cost was immense. The lessons were unforgiving, but the outcome was decisive. Guadalcanal marked the moment when the Pacific War turned from defense to offense, when the initiative passed permanently to the Allies. It proved that Japan could be stopped, that its forces could be worn down, that the war could be carried forward, island by island, at terrible but survivable cost. The story of the Marines at Guadalcanal matters because it shows war stripped to essentials: men, ground, endurance. It is not a story of brilliance or sweeping victory. It is a story of holding when retreat would have been easier, and of discovering in the process what kind of war lay ahead. Tonight, we return to that island, to the jungle and the airstrip, to the nights lit by flares and fire, to the first hard step forward in a long Pacific War. This is the story of the U.S. Marines at Guadalcanal. And before we continue, I want to speak to you directly. If you're still here, listening all the way through, if these long, immersive journeys into history help you slow down, reflect, or disconnect from the noise of the day, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is Guadalcanal, July 2nd, 1942. Martin Clemens crouched in the damp shadows of a Guadalcanal hillside, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the frequency dial on his Coast Watcher radio. Through his binoculars, he watched something that shouldn't exist. Hundreds of Japanese construction workers swarming across a coastal plain, their machinery carving an airstrip out of the jungle. The whine of bulldozers echoed through the valley. Clemens keyed his microphone and whispered the coordinates that would change the Pacific War. In 3 weeks, 19,000 American Marines would storm this beach to capture an airfield that nobody in Washington had heard of 6 months earlier. The island's name would become synonymous with suffering, but on this humid morning, it was just another green dot on a map that stretched across 10,000 miles of ocean. The strategic situation in mid-1942 offered Americans nothing but bad choices and worse alternatives. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Empire controlled an area larger than the continental United States. Their forces occupied the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and were pushing toward Australia itself. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King studied maps that showed Japanese bases creeping southward through the Solomon Islands like a closing fist. New Guinea was already contested. If Japan established air bases in the southern Solomons, they could cut the supply line between America and Australia, potentially forcing the continent into submission or isolation. King's staff presented him with intelligence reports about a Japanese construction project on an island called Guadalcanal, a name so obscure that most Navy officers had to search for it on their charts. The reports indicated the airfield was perhaps 60% complete. King made a decision that violated every principle of military planning. He would launch America's first offensive operation of the Pacific War against this target, and he would do it immediately with whatever forces could be scraped together. The unit selected for this desperate gamble was the 1st Marine Division, an organization that existed more on paper than in reality. Formed just 8 months earlier in February of 1941, the division had never operated as a complete unit. Its component battalions were scattered across the Pacific, some in Samoa, others in New Zealand, a few still training in North Carolina. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, the division commander, was a thoughtful Virginian who preferred careful preparation to rushed improvisation. When he received orders on July 5th to invade Guadalcanal on August 1st, he felt something close to despair. His division had never conducted a single amphibious exercise together. They had no maps of the target island beyond a few outdated hydrographic charts. Intelligence consisted of grainy photographs and reports from Australian coast watchers who operated behind Japanese lines. Vandegrift's protests earned him a 5-day postponement. The invasion would now occur on August 7th, giving his Marines 33 days to prepare for the most complex military operation in American history, an opposed amphibious assault against a defended enemy position. The rehearsal landing at Koro Island in Fiji on July 22nd revealed the scale of the disaster waiting to happen. Landing craft beached in the wrong locations, depositing confused Marines hundreds of yards from their intended positions. Supplies that were supposed to come ashore in organized waves instead arrived in chaotic jumbles or didn't arrive at all. Radios failed in the tropical humidity. Several landing craft sank in the surf, taking their cargo to the bottom. Vandegrift watched the debacle through binoculars and understood that his Marines were about to attempt something for which they were catastrophically unprepared. The Navy offered no comfort. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force that would support the landing, made it clear he intended to withdraw his precious aircraft carriers after just 2 days offshore. Fletcher had lost the carrier Lexington at Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway. He would not risk his remaining flat tops in waters where Japanese land-based aircraft could reach them. Vandegrift's protests were noted and ignored. The Marines would have 48 hours of air cover, and then they would be on their own. What made the operation truly desperate was that it violated the fundamental strategic plan that governed Allied operations. The United States and Britain had agreed on a Germany-first strategy. The European theater would receive priority for men and material until Hitler was defeated. The Pacific was supposed to be a holding action, a defensive posture that prevented further Japanese expansion but didn't seek to roll back their conquests until after Germany surrendered. Guadalcanal shattered this agreement. Admiral King, frustrated by what he saw as excessive caution, essentially launched an offensive without waiting for approval from the combined chiefs of staff. He justified the operation by arguing that it was defensive in nature, merely seizing an airfield to prevent Japanese bombers from threatening the Australia supply line. This semantic sleight of hand couldn't hide the reality that America was about to commit significant forces to an offensive campaign in the Pacific, while the Battle of Stalingrad raged and Rommel threatened Egypt. The decision created immediate problems. Resources that might have gone to Europe instead went to the South Pacific. Ships, landing craft, supplies, all were diverted to support an operation that had been conceived in haste and planned in chaos. The geographical challenges alone should have delayed the operation by months. Guadalcanal sits in the Solomon Islands chain, roughly 1,000 miles northeast of Australia and 1,500 miles south of the massive Japanese naval and air base at Rabaul. The island itself is 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered in jungle so dense that visibility sometimes drops to less than 10 yards. Mountains rise to 8,000 feet along the spine of the island, and rivers flood during the afternoon rains that arrive with tropical regularity. The climate is punishing even by Pacific standards. Temperatures hover around 90 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity above 85%. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes swarm in clouds. Fungal infections attack any cut or abrasion. The terrain that American planners saw on maps as coastal plain was actually a mixture of kunai grass, 6 feet tall, swamps, and jungle that had never been properly surveyed. The Japanese had chosen the northwest corner of the island for their airfield, precisely because it offered one of the few areas flat enough for aircraft operations. This same geographical limitation meant the Marines would know exactly where they needed to land, and the Japanese would know exactly where to expect them. As the invasion fleet assembled in the Fiji Islands in late July, the scale of the improvisation became apparent to everyone involved. The 1st Marine Division would land with 19,000 men, but only 11,000 were trained infantry. The rest were support troops, cooks, clerks, mechanics, artillerymen. They carried 60 days of ammunition and 90 days of food, quantities that sounded substantial until officers calculated consumption rates under combat conditions. The Marines had no tanks. Their heaviest weapons were 37mm anti-tank guns that were already obsolete in Europe. They had no proper intelligence maps, no knowledge of Japanese defensive positions, and no clear understanding of how many enemy troops occupied the island. Estimates range from 2,500 to 8,000 Japanese defenders. The actual number of combat troops was closer to 600, but thousands of construction workers and laborers were also present. The Marines prepared for the worst-case scenario because they had no reliable information to suggest otherwise. The final element that made Guadalcanal a gamble rather than a calculated operation was the command structure itself. The South Pacific area sat exactly on the boundary between General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command and Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Ocean Areas Command. Neither man had clear authority over the Solomons. The compromise solution placed Vice Admiral Robert Gormley in command of the South Pacific, reporting to Nimitz, but required to coordinate with MacArthur. This divided authority meant that resources remained split between competing commands even as the Marines prepared to invade. MacArthur's forces in New Guinea couldn't provide support because they fell under different command. Army Air Force's bombers that might have suppressed Japanese airfields at Rabaul instead focused on targets in MacArthur's area of operations. The Marines sailing toward Guadalcanal would fight their battle with whatever the Navy could provide, and nothing more. On July 31st, General Vandegrift gathered his officers for a final briefing aboard the transport ship Macaulay. He spread out the limited maps and photographs they possessed and walked through the plan one more time. The 1st and 5th Marines would land on Guadalcanal itself, their objective the airfield and the surrounding area. The 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion would assault the smaller islands across Sealark Channel, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, where Japanese seaplane bases were located. The operation would begin with a pre-dawn naval bombardment, followed by the first waves hitting the beaches at sunrise. If everything went according to plan, they would secure the airfield within 48 hours. Vandegrift didn't share his private assessment that nothing would go according to plan. His Marines were as ready as they could be, given 3 weeks of preparation. They would learn their trade in combat, or they would die trying. The ships turned north and increased speed, carrying young men toward an island that would test everything Americans believed about themselves and their military. The tension aboard the transports as they approached Guadalcanal was unlike anything the Marines had experienced in training. Most were teenagers or men in their early 20s. They had joined the Marines seeking adventure or fleeing the Depression, expecting the traditional life of garrison duty and peacetime routine. Pearl Harbor had changed everything, but even boot camp couldn't fully prepare them for the reality of what they were about to attempt. Many had never seen combat. Some had never left the United States before joining their units. They cleaned their rifles obsessively, checked their equipment, and tried to sleep despite the heat and their racing thoughts. Veterans of the China service told stories about Japanese fighting techniques, banzai charges, infiltration tactics, no surrender. The younger Marines listened and wondered if they would measure up. On August 6th, the chaplains held services on the transport decks. Men who hadn't prayed since childhood found themselves asking for courage, for survival, for the strength to do their duty. As darkness fell and the ships approached the Solomon Islands, the Marines went below to their cramped berthing areas. They would wake in a few hours to the sound of naval guns firing, and nothing would ever be the same again. 6:14 in the morning, August 7th, 1942. The landing craft's ramp dropped with a metallic crash, and Private First Class Robert Leckie stumbled forward into waist-deep water that felt blood-warm against his skin. He had expected bullets, mortars, the scream of incoming fire that training films had promised. Instead, he heard only the slap of waves against the beach and the labored breathing of the Marines around him. The first wave waded ashore in eerie silence. Leckie's hands gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. But there was nothing to shoot at. The beach was empty. Behind him, more landing craft were approaching, their ramps already dropping, men pouring out into the water with weapons ready. Someone laughed nervously. Another Marine whispered, "Where are they?" The beach that was supposed to be a killing ground looked like a tourist postcard. The naval bombardment that preceded the landing had been impressive and utterly wasted. 8 heavy cruisers and 15 destroyers had pounded the landing beaches for 90 minutes, firing thousands of shells into coconut groves and kunai grass fields. The thunder of the guns had echoed across Sea Lark Channel, and plumes of smoke rose thousands of feet into the tropical sky. Aboard the transport ships, Marines had watched the spectacle and felt reassured that the Navy was destroying whatever Japanese defenses awaited them. The reality was different. The Japanese had no defenses on the landing beaches because they never expected an attack from the north. Their construction workers and laborers were housed near the airfield, 2 miles inland. The combat troops that did exist were positioned to defend against an attack from the sea approaches near the airfield itself. When the American bombardment began, the Japanese commander made an instant decision: evacuate everyone into the jungle and wait to see where the Americans actually landed. By the time the first Marines stepped onto Red Beach, every Japanese soldier and worker had already disappeared into the dense vegetation that began just yards from the shore. The advance inland proceeded with surreal ease that grew more unsettling with each passing hour. Marines who had trained for months to assault defended positions instead found themselves walking through abandoned campsites. At 9:30 in the morning, lead elements reached the first Japanese encampment and stopped in confusion. Rice was still cooking in pots over small fires. Construction equipment sat with engines running, as if the operators had simply walked away mid-task. Half-eaten bowls of food sat on makeshift tables. Clothing hung on lines strung between trees. It looked like the Marie Celeste of military camps. Everything present except the people. Gunnery sergeants ordered the advance to continue, but the Marines moved cautiously now, expecting ambush at every turn. The ambush never came. By mid-afternoon, the lead battalions approached the airfield itself. They could see the coral runway stretching nearly 4,000 feet. Grading equipment parked alongside, supplies stacked in neat rows. Not a single shot had been fired. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Marines of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, walked onto the airfield and claimed it for the United States. The radio message back to the fleet was brief. Airfield secured, no enemy contact. While Guadalcanal fell without a fight, across Sea Lark Channel, a different battle was unfolding. The 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion hit the tiny islands of Tulagi, WW2, and Tanambogo, expecting light resistance. Instead, they encountered Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops who had turned the islands into fortified positions. Caves honeycombed the coral ridges. Concrete bunkers covered every approach. The Japanese had no intention of evacuating these positions. They would fight until death in place. The Marines landing on Tulagi's beaches at 8 in the morning walked into a firestorm. Machine gun fire raked the boats while they were still offshore. Mortars began dropping among the landing craft. Men fell before they reached the beach. Those who made it ashore found themselves pinned down by fire coming from positions they couldn't see. The raiders began the slow, brutal work of reducing fortified positions one by one, grenades into cave mouths, flamethrowers against bunker firing slits, demolition charges to collapse tunnels. Progress was measured in the yards per hour. The fighting on WW2 and Tanambogo proved even more vicious because the islands were so small that artillery couldn't be used without risking friendly casualties. The 1st Parachute Battalion landed on WW2 at noon and immediately sustained heavy casualties from Japanese troops, firing from caves and bunkers built into the hillside. The battalion commander, Major Robert Williams, was shot through the face within minutes of landing. His executive officer took command and ordered a frontal assault up Hill 281, the dominant terrain feature on the tiny island. Marines climbed over coral rock under constant fire, throwing grenades into cave openings, using flamethrowers when they could get close enough. The Japanese responded with grenades of their own and occasional banzai charges from unexpected positions. By nightfall, WW2 was secured, but the battalion had suffered 144 casualties, nearly 20% of its strength in a single afternoon. Tanambogo remained in Japanese hands, connected to WW2 by a narrow causeway that had become a death trap. 3 times Marines tried to rush across the causeway. 3 times they were driven back by converging fire. The island wouldn't fall until the next day, after destroyers moved to point-blank range and fired directly into the Japanese positions. The contrast between the 2 landings revealed something important about the Japanese defensive philosophy that would shape the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Where the Japanese expected to fight, the small strategic islands controlling the seaplane base, they had prepared elaborate defenses and fought with suicidal determination. Where they hadn't anticipated combat, the Guadalcanal landing beaches, they had nothing. This suggested either a failure of imagination or a lack of resources, and intelligence officers weren't sure which. Either way, it meant the Japanese would need time to prepare a defense of the airfield, and that time would be measured in days or weeks, not hours. The question was whether the Marines could use that time to prepare their own defenses before the Japanese counterattacked. Everything depended on how quickly reinforcements could arrive, and from which direction. The captured supplies on Guadalcanal provided the first good news the Marines had received since landing. Warehouses near the airfield contained food, gasoline, oil, construction equipment, even sake and beer. The Japanese had been preparing to support their construction operation for months, and their logistics had been thorough. Marines inventoried 13 steamrollers, dozens of trucks, generating equipment, machine tools, and enough rice to feed a small army for weeks. The gasoline and oil were particularly valuable, thousands of gallons in drums and tanks, fuel that could power equipment and vehicles. The construction equipment would prove essential in the coming days as Marines worked to improve the airfield defenses. Less welcome were signs of how much work remained to complete the airstrip. The coral surface was rough and uneven. Drainage was poor, meaning heavy rain would turn sections into mud. The runway was barely 3,700 feet long, marginal for fully loaded fighter aircraft. Most concerning, there were no revetments, no protected areas where aircraft could be hidden from air attack. The airfield was operationally captured, but not operationally useful, not yet. As night fell on August 7th, General Vandegrift established his command post in a Japanese dugout near the airfield and took stock of the situation. His Marines held a perimeter roughly 2,000 yards deep and 6,000 yards wide, roughly rectangular with the airfield at its center. Approximately 11,000 Marines were ashore on Guadalcanal, with another 3,000 across the channel fighting on the smaller islands. Casualties had been remarkably light on Guadalcanal. Fewer than a dozen wounded, none killed. The lack of resistance bothered Vandegrift more than combat would have. Somewhere in the jungle, perhaps as many as 5,000 or 6,000 Japanese troops and construction workers were watching, waiting, planning. They would attack eventually, and the Marines would have to be ready. More immediately concerning was Admiral Fletcher, The carrier commander had already radioed that he intended to withdraw his carriers the next day, a full day earlier than the already pessimistic 2-day estimate. Fletcher cited Japanese air attacks that afternoon. His ships had shot down several bombers, but the threat was clear. If he stayed, he risked losing his carriers. Vandegrift understood the logic, but also understood what it meant. The Marines would lose air cover within 36 hours of landing. The first Japanese air attack arrived at 1:15 on the afternoon of August 7th, just hours after the landing. Marines on the ground heard the unfamiliar wail of air raid sirens, equipment captured from the Japanese and already put to use. Looking up, they saw formations of twin-engine bombers approaching in neat V formations, escorted by Zero fighters. Anti-aircraft guns aboard the transport ships and cruisers opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs. Several Japanese aircraft fell trailing smoke, but others pressed their attacks. Bombs fell among the transport ships still unloading supplies. Near misses threw up towers of water. One transport took a direct hit and began listing. Marines on the beach watched the battle and realized how vulnerable they were. If the Navy left, those attacks would fall on them instead, and they had no protection beyond scattered foxholes. The psychological impact of that first raid was profound. For the first time, Marines understood they were not just isolated by distance, but potentially isolated by circumstance. If the Navy decided the risk was too great, the ships would sail away and leave them stranded. The evening of August 7th brought both celebration and anxiety to the Marines around their captured airfield. Some units opened captured Japanese beer and toasted their easy victory. Others dug foxholes and prepared defensive positions, expecting counterattack. Most were simply exhausted from the heat, the tension, and the physical exertion of moving inland with full packs and equipment. As darkness fell, the jungle came alive with sounds that were simultaneously ordinary and threatening. Birds called. Something large moved through the brush. Was it an animal or a Japanese infiltrator? Trigger fingers tensed. Officers passed word to hold fire unless absolutely necessary. Ammunition had to be conserved, and muzzle flashes would reveal positions. The Marines experienced their first night in the jungle, learning that darkness in the tropics is absolute, that every shadow seems to move, that exhaustion and imagination combine to create threats that may or may not exist. When dawn broke on August 8th, Marines were relieved to discover they had survived their first night. They would soon learn that surviving was only the beginning of the test Guadalcanal had prepared for them. 1:43 in the morning, August 9th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander John William Becker stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Astoria and watched radar returns that made no sense. The green scope showed 7 large contacts approaching from the northwest at high speed, distance now less than 50 miles, and closing. Becker had never seen enemy ships on radar before. The technology was so new that most Navy officers barely understood it. He called to the officer of the deck and pointed at the screen. The contacts were definitely ships, definitely approaching, definitely hostile. This was the warning the fleet needed. Becker prepared to sound general quarters and wake the sleeping crew. Then he hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if these were American ships that had somehow gotten off station? Waking the admiral at 0:30 with a false alarm could end a junior officer's career. He decided to verify the contact before raising the alarm. 3 minutes passed while Becker requested confirmation from the radar operator. Those 3 minutes would cost over 1,000 American lives. The Japanese force steaming down what would soon be known as the Slot, the narrow passage between the Solomon Islands, represented everything the U.S. Navy feared and hadn't prepared for. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commanded a column of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, approaching from Rabaul with orders to destroy the American invasion fleet. His ships had departed Rabaul at noon on August 8th, racing south at nearly 30 knots. American search planes had spotted them that afternoon, but the contact report was delayed, garbled, and ultimately lost in the communication chaos of the invasion operation. By the time it reached Admiral Fletcher's flagship, the information was 9 hours old, and Fletcher assumed the Japanese force had turned back. Instead, Mikawa had continued south through the afternoon and evening, his ships maintaining radio silence, his crews at battle stations. The Japanese admiral had timed his approach to arrive after midnight, when American vigilance would be lowest. His battle plan was elegant in its simplicity. Race past Savo Island, split his force into 2 columns, and attack the cruisers guarding the transport anchorage from both sides simultaneously. The American cruisers patrolling the waters north of Guadalcanal had no idea they were about to die. USS Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes formed the Northern Patrol Group, with several destroyers screening ahead. To the south, HMAS Canberra and USS Chicago guarded the other approach with their own destroyer screen. The ships were at Condition 2, a reduced state of readiness with half the crew on watch while the other half slept. Sailors who had been at general quarters for 3 straight days were exhausted. The cruiser commanders expected Japanese air attack at dawn, but assumed the night would be quiet. Surface combat seemed unlikely. Japanese ships would have to travel several hundred miles to reach the invasion area, and surely American search planes would spot them. None of the American commanders knew that the search plane report had never reached them. None knew that Japanese cruisers were now less than 20 miles away, approaching at 30 knots with loaded torpedo tubes and guns trained out. The Battle of Savo Island began with a searchlight. At 1:43 a.m., Japanese cruisers illuminated USS Blue, the destroyer on picket duty north of Savo Island. Before Blue could react, torpedoes were already in the water. The destroyer somehow survived, but now the Japanese had achieved their objective. They knew where the American ships were. Mikawa's cruisers turned toward their targets and increased speed to 33 knots. On Astoria's bridge, Lieutenant Commander Becker finally sounded general quarters, but it was too late. Groggy sailors rushed to battle stations in their underwear, rubbing sleep from their eyes, not understanding what was happening. At 1:48 a.m., Japanese searchlights snapped on, illuminating Astoria from bow to stern. For a moment the scene looked almost peaceful, a ship picked out in brilliant light against the darkness of the tropical night. Then, the first salvo arrived. 8-inch shells from Chokai and Ioba smashed into Astoria's superstructure, starting fires, killing the bridge crew, destroying fire control systems. More shells followed, the Japanese cruisers firing as fast as their crews could load. Astoria's guns began to return fire, but the ship was already dying. Quincy died even faster. Caught between 2 columns of Japanese cruisers, the American ship took fire from both sides simultaneously. Shells penetrated the thin deck armor and exploded in the engineering spaces. The bridge took a direct hit that killed the captain and most of his staff. Fires spread from stem to stern. Quincy's guns continued firing even as the ship lost way and began to list. At 2:10 a.m., barely 20 minutes after the battle began, Quincy rolled over and sank, taking down 520 men. Sailors in the water watched their ship disappear beneath the waves, the propellers still turning as she went under. Vincennes lasted slightly longer but suffered the same fate. Multiple torpedoes struck below the waterline, flooding the forward compartments. The engineering plant lost steam. By 2:30 a.m., the captain gave the order to abandon ship. Vincennes sank at 2:50 a.m., taking 332 men to the bottom. In less than 40 minutes, 3 American heavy cruisers had been reduced to burning wrecks or sent to the ocean floor. The Southern Attack Group fared no better. HMAS Canberra, an Australian cruiser operating with the U.S. Navy, took the first blow. Japanese torpedoes and shells struck within seconds of each other. The cruiser lost power immediately and began to burn. 84 men died in the initial attack. Chicago managed to escape serious damage through a combination of luck and Japanese focus on other targets, but she fired barely a shot in return. The Japanese column swept past the burning Canberra and turned north, looking for more targets. They found the destroyer USS Jarvis, already damaged from air attacks earlier in the day. The Japanese cruisers finished her off with gunfire. Jarvis went down with all hands. No survivors. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese had destroyed 4 heavy cruisers, heavily damaged 2 others, and sunk a destroyer. American casualties exceeded 1,000 dead. Japanese casualties totaled 58 men. It was the worst defeat in U.S. Navy history, worse than Pearl Harbor in terms of ships lost in combat. The stunning aspect of the battle wasn't just the defeat, but how close the Japanese came to achieving even more. Admiral Mikawa's original orders were to attack the cruisers and then move into the transport anchorage to destroy the vulnerable cargo ships and transports. With those ships sunk, the Marines on Guadalcanal would be completely cut off, without supplies or hope of evacuation. Victory would have been inevitable, but Mikawa hesitated. His ships had expended enormous amounts of ammunition in the surface action. Dawn was approaching, and with dawn would come American carrier aircraft. Or so he believed. Fletcher's carriers had already withdrawn, but Mikawa didn't know that. Fearing air attack, the Japanese admiral made the decision to withdraw. His cruisers turned north and raced back up the slot, leaving the American transports untouched. It was a tactical masterpiece undermined by strategic caution. The Japanese had won the battle, but failed to exploit the victory. The Marines on Guadalcanal were bloodied, but not doomed. Dawn on August 9th revealed the magnitude of the disaster to the Marines watching from shore. Pillars of black smoke rose from the waters north of Savo Island. Survivors floated in oil-slicked seas, clinging to debris. Rescue operations began immediately, but the psychological impact was devastating. The Navy had promised to protect the Marines. Instead, the Navy had been destroyed. Worse news followed. Admiral Fletcher, citing the loss of fighter aircraft in air attacks and now the destruction of the cruiser force, ordered all remaining ships to withdraw immediately. The transports that were still unloading supplies pulled up anchor and began steaming away, even though half their cargo remained in their holds. Marines on the beach watched the ships disappear over the horizon and understood they were now completely alone. Vandegrift gathered his officers and gave them the reality. They had 37 days of food instead of 60. They had half the planned ammunition. They had minimal medical supplies. All heavy construction equipment was still aboard the retreating transports. The Marines would have to make do with what they had, because no one knew when or if resupply would arrive. The Battle of Savo Island changed the nature of the Guadalcanal campaign in ways neither side fully understood at the time. For the Japanese, it demonstrated that their navy could dominate the waters around Guadalcanal during darkness, moving freely to land reinforcements and shell American positions. This led directly to the creation of the Tokyo Express, the fast destroyer runs that would characterize the next 4 months of naval warfare. For the Americans, Savo Island revealed catastrophic weaknesses in night fighting capability, radar use, and communication. The Navy had superior technology, radar, but hadn't trained to use it effectively in combat. Officers who could read a radar scope were rare, and doctrine for responding to radar contacts barely existed. Most importantly, Savo Island established that control of the seas around Guadalcanal would swing back and forth between the two sides, depending on time of day. Americans dominated during daylight when their aircraft from Henderson Field could operate. Japanese dominated at night when their superior night fighting skills gave them the advantage. The Marines left behind on Guadalcanal tried to process what had happened. They had landed with the full might of the U.S. Navy behind them. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers. 72 hours later, the Navy was gone, and not voluntarily. Enemy ships had come in the night and destroyed the protective screen in less than an hour. The implications were terrifying. If the Japanese Navy could do this once, they could do it again. The Marines could wake up any morning to find Japanese battleships bombarding their positions with 14-inch guns, and there would be nothing to stop it. Officers tried to maintain morale by emphasizing that the Marines had captured the airfield, which was true. Once aircraft were operating from Henderson Field, they could provide air cover, but Henderson Field was still just a rough coral strip with minimal facilities. Getting it operational would take time, and time was something the Marines might not have. On the night of August 9th, Marines dug their foxholes deeper and faced the jungle darkness, knowing they were more isolated than any American military force since Bataan. Unlike Bataan, however, they had no plans to surrender. They would hold the airfield or die trying. August 12th, 1942, 10:20 in the morning. The first air raid siren wailed across Henderson Field just as Marines were finishing breakfast. The captured Japanese equipment gave them about 90 seconds warning, not enough to do anything except run. Private Anthony Malinowski dropped his canteen cup of coffee and sprinted toward the nearest foxhole. a hole in the ground barely 3 feet deep that he'd dug the previous afternoon. Behind him, 27 Japanese bombers approached in perfect formation at 20,000 feet, their bomb bay doors already open. Malinowski dove into his foxhole just as the first bombs began to fall. The earth heaved. Concussion waves rolled across the field. Coral dust filled the air so thick he couldn't breathe without choking. The bombs walked across Henderson Field in a neat pattern, each explosion destroying whatever occupied that piece of ground. When silence finally returned, Malinowski climbed out and looked around. His foxhole was half full of muddy water from a shell crater that had appeared 15 feet away. This was condition black, air raid imminent, and it would become as routine as morning coffee. The supply situation that emerged after the Navy's withdrawal bordered on catastrophic. Quartermaster Sergeant James Childs had the unenviable job of inventorying what remained and calculating how long it would last. The numbers he compiled made grim reading. The Marines had landed with 90 days of rations for 19,000 men. The Navy had withdrawn with roughly half those supplies still aboard the transports. Simple arithmetic meant the remaining food would last 45 days if consumption continued at normal rates. But normal rates assumed 3 meals per day at full rations. Childs recommended immediately cutting to 2 meals, breakfast and dinner, and reducing portion sizes by approximately 1/3. General Vandegrift approved the recommendation because there was no alternative. Starting August 12th, Marines received 2 meals daily, each meal providing roughly 900 calories. A Marine performing manual labor in 90-degree heat requires approximately 3,500 calories to maintain body weight and function. The math was simple and brutal. Every Marine on Guadalcanal would slowly starve unless resupply arrived. The captured Japanese supplies provided temporary relief, but came with their own problems. Marines inventoried 1,500 bags of rice, 500 tins of crab meat, cases of canned vegetables, and quantities of sake, beer, and cigarettes that seemed almost comical given the circumstances. The rice alone represented weeks of sustenance, but American Marines in 1942 had no idea how to cook rice properly. The first attempts produced either crunchy, undercooked grains or a sticky paste that was barely edible. Marines learned through trial and error, comparing their attempts to what they found in abandoned Japanese cooking areas. Within a week, rice became a staple of the Marine diet, bland, filling, and monotonous. The canned crab meat and vegetables provided variety for a few days until they ran out. Then the diet became rice, and whatever could be captured, scrounged, or improvised. Marines joked that they were fighting on borrowed rations, eating food that had been meant for the Japanese. The humor masked growing concern about what would happen when even the captured food ran out. The jungle itself became an enemy more immediate than the Japanese soldiers hiding within it. Guadalcanal's environment was specifically designed to destroy human health. Humidity exceeded 85% almost constantly, meaning sweat never dried, clothing never dried, equipment never dried. Fungal infections bloomed on any cut or abrasion. Marines called it jungle rot. Open sores that wouldn't heal, that spread if left untreated, that could become infected and life-threatening. By mid-August, 80% of the Marines on Guadalcanal had some form of jungle rot on their feet, hands, or bodies. Medical officers treated the infections with sulfur powder when it was available, and with nothing when it wasn't. Men with infections on their feet could barely walk, but walked anyway because there was no choice. Boots disintegrated in the constant moisture, uniforms rotted, metal equipment rusted. The jungle consumed everything organic and corroded everything inorganic. Malaria arrived with the inevitability of a curse. The first confirmed cases appeared on August 17th. 3 Marines reporting with high fevers, chills, and the characteristic cyclic symptoms of malaria. Medical officers knew this was only the beginning. Anopheles mosquitoes swarmed in clouds around any standing water, and Guadalcanal was mostly swamp and puddle. The mosquitoes bred in foxholes that filled with rainwater during afternoon storms. They bred in shell craters. They bred in the wheel ruts left by trucks on muddy roads. Every Marine would be bitten hundreds of times daily. Every bite risked infection with plasmodium parasites that cause malaria. The standard treatment was quinine, but the Navy had withdrawn before most medical supplies could be unloaded. The initial stockpile of quinine tablets would last perhaps 3 weeks if used sparingly. After that, Marines would contract malaria and suffer through it without treatment. The disease wouldn't kill most of them. Malaria's fatality rate is relatively low, but it would reduce them to shaking, fevered invalids unable to perform military duties. By September, medical projections indicated that 100% of the force would eventually contract malaria. The only question was whether they would remain effective while infected. Dysentery joined malaria as the twin plagues of Guadalcanal. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and the general breakdown of hygiene combined to create perfect conditions for bacterial and amoebic dysentery. The disease spread through the Marine positions, like wildfire. By late August, 25% of the Marines on Guadalcanal suffered from dysentery in various stages. The symptoms, bloody diarrhea, dehydration, severe abdominal pain, left men weakened and unable to perform strenuous activities. Latrines became vectors for disease transmission because proper sanitation was impossible to maintain. Water purification tablets helped, but couldn't eliminate all bacterial contamination. Marines boiled water when they could, but often drank from streams and shell craters when they couldn't. The medical staff struggled to treat dysentery cases with limited supplies of sulfadoanidine, the standard treatment. More commonly, Marines simply endured the disease until it ran its course, then returned to duty even if not fully recovered. The combination of malnutrition, malaria, and dysentery reduced the effective strength of the Marine force by perhaps 30% within the first month. Hygiene collapsed in ways that seemed trivial, but had serious consequences. Marines had no soap, no laundry facilities, no way to clean uniforms except by wearing them into the ocean during rare breaks. Body odor became universal and ignored. Everyone stank, so no one noticed. More serious were dental problems that emerged from poor diet and no oral hygiene. Toothbrushes were lost or discarded. Toothpaste ran out. Marines developed cavities, gum infections, and abscesses that could become life-threatening without dental care. The division dental officer did what he could with minimal equipment, mostly extracting teeth that were too damaged to save. Marines learned to accept that minor medical problems would become major medical problems over time, and major medical problems might prove fatal. The isolation meant no medical evacuation, no hospital ship, no advanced care. The division field hospital treated what it could with what it had, and patients either recovered or didn't. The defensive perimeter around Henderson Field contracted as Marines realized they lacked the manpower to defend a larger area. The initial perimeter had extended roughly 2,000 yards in all directions from the airfield. By August 20th, Vandegrift ordered a contraction to approximately 1,000 yards. This meant abandoning forward positions and bringing the entire force into a more compact, defensible area. Everything beyond the perimeter became no man's land, territory that belonged to whoever had the strength to occupy it. Japanese patrols operated freely in the jungle beyond the perimeter. At night, both sides sent out patrols that sometimes blundered into each other in the darkness, leading to brief, vicious firefights. More often, the patrols simply watched each other, both sides gathering intelligence and avoiding contact. The Marines fortified their new perimeter with barbed wire scavenged from Japanese supplies, machine gun positions sited to provide interlocking fields of fire, and mortar pits positioned to support any sector under attack. The psychological toll of isolation began to manifest in ways that concerned Marine officers. Men who had been confident and aggressive during the landing now became nervous and jumpy. The combination of constant air raids, inadequate food, disease, and the knowledge that the Navy had abandoned them created a low-grade anxiety that pervaded the entire force. Some Marines became convinced they would die on Guadalcanal, that the island was a trap from which there was no escape. Officers worked to maintain morale by emphasizing that the situation was temporary, that resupply would arrive, that the Navy would return. But privately, even Vandegrift wasn't sure those statements were true. The strategic situation in the Pacific remained unclear. Japanese forces controlled vast areas. American forces were stretched thin. Guadalcanal might be viewed in Washington as an expensive diversion rather than a critical objective. The The Marines might be left on the island to hold out as long as possible before inevitable defeat. On August 19th, a Japanese supply dump was discovered in the jungle beyond the perimeter, apparently abandoned during the initial withdrawal. Marines sent to investigate found cases of canned beef, fish, vegetables, sake, and beer, enough to provide a brief feast for the entire division if distributed carefully. Vandegrift authorized one hot meal using the captured supplies before they spoiled in the tropical heat. For one evening, Marines ate food that wasn't rice, drank beer that was still cold, and tried to remember what normal life felt like. The brief celebration couldn't hide the underlying reality. The captured supplies would last a few days at most. Then it would be back to 2 meals of rice and whatever could be scrounged. The Marines on Guadalcanal were learning that war in the Pacific would be won or lost, not through dramatic battles, but through the ability to sustain forces across thousands of miles of ocean. Right now, the Americans were losing that contest. Japanese bombers attacked daily with impunity. Japanese ships operated freely at night. Japanese troops in the jungle had supply lines running back to Rabaul. The Marines had Henderson Field and little else. Everything would depend on whether that airfield could be made operational before the Japanese decided to attack in force. August 12th, 1942, dawn. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Fike stood at the eastern end of the captured airstrip and surveyed what would become the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific War. The runway stretched 3,778 feet through coconut groves and kunai grass, its surface a mixture of packed coral and dirt that looked almost white in the morning sun. Japanese construction equipment sat abandoned alongside drainage ditches half completed. Engineering stakes marked sections that needed grading. To an untrained eye, the airfield looked nearly finished. To Fike's experienced assessment, it was a construction site masquerading as an airfield. The coral surface was too rough for safe operations. Drainage was inadequate, meaning heavy rain would create standing water and mud. There were no taxiways, no revetments, no fuel storage, no ammunition bunkers. The airfield could not support actual air operations in its current state. Fike calculated that, with sufficient labor and equipment, he could make it operational in perhaps 3 weeks. He had neither sufficient labor nor equipment, and the Marines needed the field operational in days, not weeks. The arrival of Naval Construction Battalion personnel, the legendary Seabees, on August 15th changed everything. 400 construction specialists came ashore with heavy equipment, technical expertise, and a work ethic that bordered on fanatical. Commander Joseph Cub, leading the Seabee detachment, met with Fike and Vandegrift to assess the situation. The requirements were clear: extend and level the runway, install proper drainage, create dispersal areas for aircraft, build fuel storage facilities, and construct revetments to protect parked aircraft from bombing and strafing. Oh, and do it all while Japanese bombers attacked daily and time was measured in hours, not days. Cub looked at the task and said his men could do it in 1 week. Vandegrift approved the plan because he had no choice. Without an operational airfield, the Marines were simply targets waiting to be destroyed. With an operational airfield and aircraft, they might survive. The construction work began immediately and continued around the clock. Seabees operated bulldozers and graders in shifts that lasted 12 hours or more. When air raid sirens sounded, which happened 2 or 3 times daily, the equipment operators would drive their machines to the nearest cover, wait out the bombing, then return to work. Marines not on immediate perimeter defense were assigned to manual labor details, filling sandbags, digging drainage ditches, and clearing vegetation. The Japanese had left behind an unexpected gift, 13 steamrollers that proved essential for compacting the coral surface. Engineers discovered that the coral, when properly graded and compacted, created a surface hard enough to support aircraft operations. The challenge was achieving uniform compaction across the entire runway length while bombs fell and supplies dwindled. The runway surface required innovation that would become standard across the Pacific Theater: Marston matting. These interlocking steel planks, each 10 feet long and 15 inches wide with perforations to reduce weight and improve drainage, could be laid directly over prepared coral to create an instant runway surface. The Marines had 1,316 panels of Marston matting, barely enough to cover the critical sections of the runway. Engineers prioritized the touchdown and takeoff zones, leaving the mid-runway section as compacted coral. Each panel weighed 65 pounds and required 4 men to carry and position it. The work was backbreaking in 90-degree heat with high humidity. Marines and Seabees worked until they collapsed from heat exhaustion, rested briefly, then returned to work. There was no other option. Fuel storage became the next critical problem to solve. Aircraft required aviation gasoline, and lots of it. A Wildcat fighter consumed approximately 45 gallons per hour of operation. A Dauntless dive bomber consumed even more. The Seabees needed to create storage for thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel with no proper tanks and minimal equipment. Their solution was improvised but effective. 55-gallon drums distributed around the perimeter of the airfield, positioned far enough apart that a single bomb hit wouldn't destroy the entire fuel supply. Each drum was filled from the small quantity of aviation gas that had been captured from Japanese supplies, supplemented by fuel that a few brave transports managed to deliver during quick hit-and-run supply runs. By August 20th, Henderson Field had approximately 3,000 gallons of aviation gasoline in storage, enough for perhaps 4 days of combat operations if used carefully. Ammunition storage presented similar challenges. Without proper bunkers, ammunition had to be stored in dispersed locations and protected by sandbags. The quantity of air-to-air ammunition available for fighters was minimal, perhaps 2,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition per aircraft for 2 loads. Bombs for the dive bombers were even more scarce. The Marines had perhaps 24,000-pound bombs and an equal number of 500-pound bombs. This was enough for perhaps a dozen strike missions. Everything depended on resupply, and resupply depended on getting the airfield operational so that supplies could be flown in rather than shipped by vulnerable transports. On August 20th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 19 Wildcat fighters and 12 Dauntless dive bombers appeared in the sky south of Guadalcanal. Marines on the ground watched in disbelief as the aircraft circled the field. Checking the wind direction and runway condition, the lead fighter waggled its wings and began its landing approach. The Wildcat touched down, bounced once on the rough coral, and rolled to a stop. One by one, the remaining aircraft landed and taxied to dispersal areas that the Seabees had prepared. Marine Air Group 23 had arrived. Major John Smith, commanding Marine Fighter Squadron. 223 climbed out of his cockpit and was immediately surrounded by ground personnel desperate for news from the outside world. Smith had little encouraging to report. His squadron had left Espiritu Santo that morning with minimal fuel reserves. They had enough gas for perhaps one more flight of 4 hours duration. After that, they would be grounded unless fuel arrived. Similarly, ammunition was sufficient for perhaps 2 days of combat. The pilots had been told this was a temporary deployment, that they were flying to Guadalcanal to provide air cover until the Navy could return in force. Nobody mentioned that the Navy had no current plans to return. The immediate impact of having operational aircraft at Henderson Field was psychological as much as tactical. Marines who had endured 3 weeks of unopposed Japanese air attacks now watched their own fighters scramble to intercept incoming raids. The sight of Wildcats climbing to meet Japanese bombers was electrifying. For the first time since landing, the Marines weren't helpless victims, but active participants in the air battle. The fighter pilots faced overwhelming odds, 19 fighters against potential raids of 60 or more Japanese bombers and fighters. But they accepted those odds with grim determination. Major Smith organized his pilots into 4 plane divisions and established a rotation that kept at least one division at readiness during daylight hours. When Coast Watcher warnings came through, the ready division would scramble and climb to intercept altitude, typically around 20,000 feet. The dive bomber squadron under Major Richard Mangrum provided a different capability. The Dauntless could carry a 1,000-pound bomb and deliver it with precision against point targets like ships or buildings. More importantly, the dive bombers could strike at Japanese positions in the jungle or attack the Tokyo Express destroyer runs that were beginning to land reinforcements. The challenge was finding targets. Without proper reconnaissance, the pilots would be searching thousands of square miles of jungle and ocean for enemy positions. Coast watchers would prove essential, radioing reports of ship movements and troop concentrations that could be attacked. But in late August, the system was still improvised and unreliable. Henderson Field's completion marked a pivot point in the Guadalcanal campaign, though neither side fully recognized it at the time. The Japanese had failed to destroy the airfield during the brief window when it was defenseless. Now, with American aircraft operating from the field, any Japanese attack would face air opposition. This changed the strategic calculation fundamentally. The Japanese could no longer move ships freely through the waters around Guadalcanal during daylight hours. Troops landed at night by destroyers would face air attack during the day. Supply ships attempting to reach Guadalcanal would be vulnerable to dive bombers. Henderson Field transformed Guadalcanal from an isolated marine position into a dagger pointed at Japanese supply lines throughout the southern Solomons. The cost of completing Henderson Field had been significant. Several Seabees and Marines had been killed during air raids while working on the runway. Dozens more had been injured, mostly from accidents involving heavy equipment. The entire force was exhausted, malnourished, and increasingly sick with malaria and dysentery. But they had accomplished something that military planners had thought would take months. In 11 days, with minimal equipment and under constant air attack, American engineers had turned a muddy construction site into an operational airfield. The Marines now had their lifeline. Japanese planners in Rabaul looked at reconnaissance photographs showing American aircraft at Henderson Field and understood they faced a new situation. The backwater airfield that was supposed to be easily recaptured had become a fortress that would require major offensive operations to eliminate. The decision to commit those forces would come soon, but the window for easy victory had closed. Henderson Field was operational, and everything that followed would flow from that single accomplishment. 1 o'clock in the morning, August 21st, 1942. Corporal Leroy Diamond pressed himself against the earth behind his machine gun position and listened to sounds that didn't belong in the jungle night. Splashing. Rhythmic, steady splashing coming from the sandbar where the Ilu River met the ocean. His position anchored the eastern end of the marine defensive perimeter, and for 3 weeks he'd heard nothing but rain, insects, and the occasional wild pig. This was different. This was disciplined movement through water, many feet moving in unison. Diamond peered into the darkness, but could see nothing. The moon had set hours earlier, and the blackness was absolute. He reached for the field telephone that connected his position to the battalion command post and cranked the handle. When Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock answered, Diamond whispered 4 words that would define the night. "They're crossing the river." Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood on the western bank of the Ilu River and watched his men wade across the sandbar in the darkness. His force numbered approximately 900 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's 28th Infantry Regiment, an elite unit that had captured Guam in the war's opening days. Ichiki had received orders on Truk Island to proceed immediately to Guadalcanal, land from destroyers, and retake the airfield from what intelligence described as a small American force, poorly equipped and demoralized. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong on every count, but Ichiki had no way of knowing this. His soldiers carried 3 days of rations, minimal ammunition, and orders to attack immediately upon landing. Japanese doctrine emphasized speed, shock, and the warrior spirit, Bushido, that would overcome any material disadvantage. Ichiki had spent 2 days moving through the jungle from his landing point east of the perimeter. Now he was in position to strike what he believed was the weak eastern flank of a demoralized enemy. His plan was brutally simple: cross the river, assault the American positions in a banzai charge, and overwhelm the defenders through superior spirit and discipline. The first Japanese soldiers reached the western bank of the river at 1:15 a.m. and began forming up for the assault. They moved with remarkable discipline, maintaining unit cohesion despite crossing a tidal river in complete darkness. Officers quietly organized their men into assault waves, fixed bayonets, and prepared for the charge that would sweep away American resistance. At 1:30 a.m., Ichiki gave the order. 900 Japanese soldiers surged forward with rifles leveled, bayonets gleaming in the starlight. Voices rising in battle cries that echoed across the coconut groves. They expected to find scattered American positions manned by frightened troops who would break and run. Instead, they ran directly into the interlocking fields of fire of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock's command, who had been waiting in reinforced positions for exactly this attack. The Marine machine guns opened fire at 50 yards. Corporal Diamond's gun alone fired over 800 rounds in the first 2 minutes, his assistant gunner feeding belt after belt while the barrel glowed red hot. The Japanese assault wave simply disintegrated. Men fell in windrows, cut down before they could reach the Marine positions. Those who survived the initial fusillade kept coming, driven by training and discipline and the impossibility of retreating through their own follow-on waves. They reached the barbed wire that the Marines had emplaced and died trying to cut through it. A few broke through and reached the Marine foxholes, where hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the darkness. Marines used bayonets, knives, rifle butts, and fists. The fighting was primal and desperate, but the Japanese who broke through were too few and too isolated. They were killed or driven back within minutes. Ichiki committed his reserve force at 2:30 a.m., convinced that one more push would break the American line. Japanese soldiers charged across the same ground, now carpeted with their dead comrades, and met the same murderous fire. Marine mortar teams began dropping illumination rounds that turned night into flickering day. In that harsh light, Marines could see the true horror of what was happening. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay heaped against the barbed wire and scattered across the sandbar. The river ran red. Still the Japanese came, wave after wave, following orders that demanded they attack until victorious or dead. There was no provision in Japanese military doctrine for tactical withdrawal in the face of strong resistance. Orders were absolute, and death was preferable to the shame of retreat. Dawn on August 21st revealed a scene that shocked even hardened Marines. 770 Japanese soldiers lay dead in an area roughly 300 yards square. The bodies formed patterns that traced the assault waves, clusters around the barbed wire, scattered individuals who had made it further, concentrated masses at the river's edge where follow-on waves had bunched up under fire. Marine casualties totaled 44 killed and 71 wounded, a casualty ratio of more than 17-1. The disparity was so extreme that Marines initially suspected it was a diversionary attack, that the real assault would come from another direction. Patrols sent into the jungle east of the river found no other Japanese forces. This had been the main attack, and it had been annihilated. The aftermath of the Tenaru battle provided crucial intelligence about Japanese tactics and psychology. Marine intelligence officers interrogated the handful of Japanese prisoners. Only 3 surrendered from the entire force of 900, and examined captured documents. What emerged was a portrait of an army that valued spirit over firepower and initiative over reconnaissance. Ichiki had attacked without proper intelligence about American strength or positions. He had assumed that a frontal assault would succeed through superior morale and fighting spirit. He hadn't brought his heavy weapons forward because Japanese doctrine emphasized rapid movement over firepower. Most tellingly, his orders had contained no provision for retreat or alternative plans. The attack would succeed, or the unit would be destroyed. There was no middle option. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Marine Corps light tanks crossed the Ilu River sandbar and pursued the remnants of Ichiki's force into the jungle. The tanks were Stuart M3A1s, mounting 37mm guns and multiple machine guns. Against infantry in the open, they were devastating. The tank commanders spotted clusters of Japanese soldiers trying to organize defensive positions in the coconut groves and simply drove through them, firing canister rounds from the main guns and raking the undergrowth with machine gun fire. Japanese soldiers attempted to attack the tanks with grenades and magnetic mines, but the tank armor was proof against these weapons. By noon, organized Japanese resistance had ceased. The Ichiki detachment had been effectively destroyed as a combat unit. Colonel Ichiki's response to the disaster revealed the depths of Japanese military culture. Rather than withdraw with survivors and report the failure, he gathered his regimental colors and burned them to prevent their capture. Then he committed seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than face the shame of returning to his commanders with news of defeat. His second-in-command followed his example. The few surviving officers led small groups of soldiers deeper into the jungle, where most would eventually die from starvation, disease, or in skirmishes with Marine patrols. Of the 900 men who crossed the Ilu River, fewer than 130 survived to be evacuated by submarine weeks later. The Ichaki detachment had ceased to exist as a military unit. The lessons of Tenaru were immediately apparent to Marine commanders, but would take months to sink in at higher levels of Japanese command. The battle demonstrated that Japanese infantry tactics, massed frontal assaults emphasizing spirit over firepower, were suicidal against prepared defensive positions with interlocking machine gun fire. American doctrine emphasized firepower and combined arms coordination. Japanese doctrine emphasized individual courage and close-quarters combat. When these two philosophies collided, the result was catastrophic for the Japanese. Yet, Japanese commanders at Rabaul interpreted Tenaru not as a tactical failure, but as insufficient force applied. If 900 men failed, then 3,000 would succeed. If 3,000 failed, then 10,000 would be committed. The fundamental tactical approach remained unchanged. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, Tenaru provided a morale boost at a critical moment. They had defeated an attack by elite Japanese troops decisively and at minimal cost. The victory proved that American forces could not only hold defensive positions, but could destroy Japanese attacks through superior firepower and tactics. The psychological impact was enormous. Marines who had been anxious about Japanese fighting prowess now understood that the enemy was vulnerable, that Japanese soldiers died when shot just like anyone else, that determination alone couldn't overcome machine gun fire. The fear that had shadowed the Marines since landing began to dissipate, replaced by growing confidence in their weapons, their training, and their leaders. Henderson Field remained secure, and the Japanese had thrown away an entire battalion trying to take it. The calculus of the campaign was becoming clear. Whoever could sustain forces on Guadalcanal would eventually win, and right now, the Americans were winning that contest. August 24th, 1942, 9:50 in the morning. Major John Smith pushed his Wildcat fighter into a near-vertical climb, engine screaming at maximum power, trying desperately to gain altitude before the Japanese bombers reached Henderson Field. The Coast Watcher warning had given them 12 minutes notice, 12 minutes to scramble, take off, and climb 20,000 feet to interception altitude. It was impossible, but Smith was trying anyway because the alternative was watching Japanese bombs destroy the airfield and its precious aircraft. At 15,000 feet, he spotted them, 18 twin-engine Betty bombers in perfect V formation, escorted by at least 20 Zero fighters. Smith keyed his radio and called his 3 wingmen. They were outnumbered more than 10-1, too low to effectively engage, and running low on fuel. Smith gave the order anyway. All aircraft, attack. The men who would become known as the Cactus Air Force, Cactus being the radio call sign for Guadalcanal, were already exhausted before they flew their first mission. The pilots had flown 600 miles from Espiritu Santo to reach Henderson Field, a journey that left them with minimal fuel reserves. The ground crews who serviced their aircraft consisted of perhaps 30 mechanics and armorers, a third of what was considered necessary for proper maintenance. The aircraft themselves were worn from months of carrier operations and island hopping. Some had bullet holes patched with fabric and prayers. All were suffering from the cumulative effects of salt air, tropical humidity, and inadequate maintenance facilities. Major Richard Mangrum, commanding the dive bomber squadron, assessed his aircraft and concluded that perhaps 8 of his 12 Dauntless bombers were fully mission-capable. The rest had mechanical issues that would take days to repair, with proper parts and equipment, neither of which existed on Guadalcanal. The Coast Watcher network proved to be the salvation of Henderson Field's aircraft during those early weeks. Scattered throughout the Solomon Islands were approximately 50 Australian and New Zealand observers who had refused to evacuate when the Japanese advanced. They operated radio stations from jungle hideouts, tracking Japanese aircraft movements and radioing warnings to Henderson Field. Men like Paul Mason on Bougainville and Jack Red on New Georgia would spot Japanese formations taking off from Rabaul and immediately transmit warnings. The flight time from Rabaul to Guadalcanal was approximately 2 hours for bombers, 90 minutes for fighters. This gave Henderson Field between 60 and 90 minutes, warning of incoming raids. just enough time to scramble fighters and get them to altitude, or to disperse aircraft into the jungle revetments that Seabees had prepared around the field perimeter. The combat itself was brutal and unforgiving. The Wildcat fighter that Marine pilots flew was inferior to the Japanese Zero in almost every measurable way. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, could climb higher, and had longer range. But the Wildcat had two advantages. It was rugged, able to absorb battle damage that would destroy a Zero, and it carried .650 caliber machine guns with devastating firepower. Marine pilots developed tactics that exploited these advantages. They avoided turning dogfights where the Zero's maneuverability was decisive. Instead, they used dive and zoom attacks, diving from altitude to make high-speed firing passes, then using their speed to zoom back up before the Zeros could react. Captain Marion Carl, who would become one of the first Marine aces, described the tactic. Never turn with a Zero, never slow down, hit them hard, and get away fast. August 24th brought the first major test of the Cactus Air Force. Japanese carriers launched a major strike to coincide with a reinforcement convoy heading toward Guadalcanal. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons, primarily a carrier duel fought hundreds of miles from Guadalcanal, resulted in the sinking of the Japanese light carrier Ryujo, but failed to destroy the American carriers. More importantly for the Marines on Guadalcanal, the Japanese reinforcement convoy turned back rather than risk air attack from Henderson Field. Major Smith and his fighters engaged the Japanese bomber formations 3 times that day, shooting down 5 bombers confirmed and damaging several others. Smith himself scored 2 kills, his Wildcat's guns raking a Betty bomber until one engine caught fire and the aircraft fell away trailing smoke. The cost was high. 2 Wildcats lost, 1 pilot killed, another seriously wounded. But Henderson Field remained operational, and the Japanese learned that attacking it would be expensive. The maintenance challenges facing the ground crews bordered on the impossible. Each aircraft required approximately 10 mechanics for proper maintenance. The Cactus Air Force had 3 mechanics per aircraft, and those mechanics were working with captured Japanese tools, improvised parts, and whatever could be scavenged from wrecked aircraft. Spare parts were non-existent. When a Wildcat's engine failed, mechanics would cannibalize parts from another damaged aircraft to get one plane back into the air. Tires wore out and couldn't be replaced, so pilots learned to land on half-inflated tires that would blow out if they touched down too hard. Instruments failed and went unfixed because replacement gauges weren't available. Radios malfunctioned constantly in the tropical humidity. Aircraft that would have been grounded as unsafe in any normal situation flew combat missions because there was no alternative. The ground crews worked 18-hour days in brutal heat, sleeping under the wings of the aircraft they maintained, eating captured Japanese rice, and somehow keeping enough planes flying to defend Henderson Field. Fuel remained the most critical limitation. The initial supply of 3,000 gallons was exhausted within 3 days of combat operations. A desperate run by the destroyer USS Colquhoun on August 30th delivered another 3,000 gallons in drums that were simply rolled off the destroyer's deck into the water and retrieved by boats. This dangerous resupply method, running destroyers through Japanese-controlled waters to deliver aviation gas, became routine. Sometimes the destroyers made it. Sometimes they were sunk trying. The pilots learned to fly their missions on minimal fuel reserves, calculating exactly how long they could patrol or engage in combat before they had to return to base. Running out of fuel meant either ditching in the ocean or crash landing in the jungle, both of which usually proved fatal. Several pilots made it back to Henderson Field running on fumes, their engines coughing and dying as they touched down on the runway. September brought the first Marine aces, pilots who had scored 5 or more confirmed victories. Captain Marion Carl shot down his 5th Japanese aircraft on September 2nd, becoming the first Marine ace of the Guadalcanal campaign. Major John Smith reached ace status a few days later. Their success came at the cost of relentless physical and mental exhaustion. Combat pilots flew 3 or 4 missions daily, spending as much as 6 hours in the cockpit enduring tropical heat. G-forces during violent maneuvers, and the constant fear of being shot down over enemy territory. Between missions, they slept in tents that flooded during rain, ate inadequate food, and suffered from the same malaria and dysentery that plagued the infantry. Several pilots contracted malaria, but continued flying because there were no replacements. They took off with high fevers, flew combat missions while shaking with chills, then returned to base barely able to climb out of their cockpits. The kill ratio, achieved by the Cactus Air Force, demonstrated that superior tactics and determination could overcome material disadvantages. Despite flying inferior aircraft with minimal support, Marine pilots achieved approximately a 4-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese fighters and bombers. Every Japanese raid that approached Henderson Field faced interception. Every bomber shot down was one less aircraft bombing the Marines. Every Zero destroyed was one less fighter escorting future raids. The cumulative effect was that Japanese air operations around Guadalcanal became increasingly costly. By September 10th, Japanese commanders at Rabaul were questioning whether they could sustain the loss rates. Major raids that had included 60 or more aircraft were now reduced to 30 or 40. The number of escort fighters increased relative to bombers, indicating Japanese concern about losses. Henderson Field's aircraft had seized air superiority during daylight hours through sheer determination and skill. The dive bomber squadron contributed to air superiority in different ways. Major Mangram's Dauntless bombers struck at Japanese shipping, attempting to reinforce the island, attacked troop concentrations reported by coast watchers, and provided close air support to Marine infantry when called upon. The accuracy of dive bombing proved devastating against point targets. A Dauntless, approaching in a 70-degree dive, pilot controlling the aircraft with one hand while lining up the target with the other, could place a 1,000-pound bomb within 50 feet of aim point consistently. Japanese destroyers learned to fear the Dauntlesses, taking evasive action whenever the distinctive silhouette appeared overhead. Several destroyer runs intended to land reinforcements were turned back by dive bomber attacks that scored near misses close enough to damage hull plating and superstructure. By mid-September, the aircraft inventory at Henderson Fields told the story of attrition warfare. Of the original 31 aircraft that landed on August 20th, only 12 fighters and 6 dive bombers remained operational. The rest had been shot down, destroyed on the ground during air raids, or damaged beyond field repair. Replacement aircraft trickled in via the escort carrier USS Long Island, which would steam to within 200 miles of Guadalcanal, launch aircraft, then withdraw before Japanese aircraft could locate her. These reinforcement flights were themselves dangerous. Pilots flying unfamiliar aircraft over hundreds of miles of open ocean, with minimal navigation equipment, trying to find a single airfield on a jungle-covered island. Several pilots missed Guadalcanal entirely and were never seen again, lost over the vast Pacific. Those who arrived safely often found their aircraft immediately pressed into combat, sometimes on the same day they landed. The legend of the Cactus Air Force emerged from these impossible conditions. Pilots who, by all rights, should have been grounded, flew combat missions despite malaria, wounds, and exhaustion. Ground crews who should have had proper facilities and equipment kept aircraft flying with wire, fabric, and improvisation. Coast watchers who could have evacuated to safety instead remained at their posts, knowing that discovery by the Japanese meant certain execution. Henderson Field remained operational through sheer determination and the knowledge that, if the airfield fell, the Marines on Guadalcanal would be annihilated. The pilots understood they weren't just fighting for air superiority. They were fighting for the survival of every Marine on the island. That knowledge drove them to accomplish things that military planners had deemed impossible. And in doing so, they established the pattern that would define American air operations throughout the Pacific. Superior training, aggressive tactics, and unwavering determination could overcome numerical inferiority and material limitations. The Japanese had more aircraft, better aircraft in some respects, and shorter supply lines, but they didn't have the Cactus Air Force. September 4th, 1942, 11 o'clock at night. Private Russell Davis huddled in his foxhole and listened to the sound that had become the soundtrack of Guadalcanal nights, the high-speed rumble of destroyer engines racing down the slot. The sound was unmistakable, different from the thrum of transports or the heavier note of cruisers. These were destroyers running at flank speed, perhaps 30 knots, and they were heading directly for Guadalcanal. Davis knew what came next because he'd experienced it 3 times already this week. The destroyers would close to perhaps 10,000 yards offshore. Then their guns would open up, lobbing 8-inch shells into Henderson Field with methodical precision. The bombardment would last 30 to 40 minutes. Then the destroyers would turn and race back north before dawn brought American aircraft that could attack them. The Marines called it the Tokyo Express. The Japanese called it the Rat Run. Either way, it was transforming every night into a hell of exploding shells and flying coral. The creation of the Tokyo Express represented Japanese tactical ingenuity, compensating for strategic limitations. Unable to operate larger ships near Guadalcanal during daylight hours due to American air superiority from Henderson Field, Japanese commanders developed a solution that exploited their Navy's superior night fighting capabilities. Destroyers would load troops, supplies, and ammunition at bases up the Solomon Island chain, then race south after dark at maximum speed. They would arrive off Guadalcanal around midnight, shell American positions, land troops, and supplies in less than an hour, then withdraw northward before dawn. The speed of the operation was critical. Destroyers racing at 30 knots could cover the distance from the Japanese base at Shortland Island to Guadalcanal and back in a single night. American ships attempting to intercept faced Japanese forces that were faster, better trained for night combat, and equipped with superior torpedoes. The first major Tokyo Express run occurred on the night of September 1st. 3 Japanese destroyers raced past Savo Island, approaching Henderson Field from the northwest. The Coast Watchers had reported the ships hours earlier, but the Marines had no capability to intercept during darkness. At 11:30 p.m., the destroyers opened fire. The sound of incoming shells was unlike anything the Marines had experienced. A freight train shriek followed by earth-shaking explosions. The Japanese gunners weren't firing randomly. They had precise coordinates for Henderson Field and were systematically cratering the runway. Each destroyer carried approximately 158-inch shells allocated for shore bombardment. 450 shells fell on Henderson Field in 30 minutes. The airfield became a moonscape of overlapping craters. Aircraft parked in revetments were damaged by near misses. 2 fuel dumps exploded in sheets of flame. When silence finally returned, Marines emerged from their foxholes to find Henderson Field temporarily non-operational. The Seabees and Marine engineers began repair work immediately, working through the night by flashlight and moonlight. Bulldozers filled craters with coral. Graders smoothed the surface. By dawn, the runway was operational enough for aircraft to take off, though crater repairs would continue for days. This became the pattern. Japanese destroyers would crater the field at night. American engineers would repair it before dawn, and operations would resume. The cycle was exhausting for everyone involved. Engineers worked 18-hour days, falling asleep on their bulldozers between repair jobs. Marines assigned to airfield defense never knew whether incoming shells would hit their position or the runway hundreds of yards away. The randomness of the bombardment was psychologically devastating. There was no safe place, no way to predict where shells would fall, nothing to do except huddle in foxholes and hope. The Tokyo Express's second function, landing reinforcements, proved even more consequential than the bombardments. Japanese destroyers modified to carry troops could transport approximately 900 soldiers per run. The destroyers would race to positions off Cape Esperance or Tassafaronga on Guadalcanal's western coast, disembark troops into landing barges in 15 minutes, then withdraw. The operation was so quick that Marines rarely realized reinforcements had landed until patrols encountered Japanese troops in areas that had been empty days before. Between September 1st and September 15th, the Tokyo Express landed approximately 6,000 Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal. These troops moved inland immediately, avoiding contact with Marine patrols, establishing positions in the jungle south of Henderson Field from which they could launch attacks. Marine attempts to interdict the Tokyo Express met with limited success and high costs. The few American destroyers and cruisers available in the South Pacific lacked radar fire control systems that could match Japanese optical equipment optimized for night operations. American doctrine emphasized radar-directed gunnery, but the radar sets available in late 1942 were primitive by later standards, able to detect ships but not provide precise enough information for fire control solutions. Japanese doctrine emphasized visual identification and optical range-finding, techniques at which Japanese crews excelled. When American and Japanese ships encountered each other in darkness, the Japanese usually spotted their opponents first, launched torpedoes first, and scored first hits. The result was a series of night engagements that bloodied the U.S. Navy without stopping the Tokyo Express. September 8th brought a bombardment that demonstrated how effective the Tokyo Express had become. 5 Japanese destroyers approached Henderson Field at midnight and conducted a perfectly coordinated bombardment that lasted 42 minutes. The destroyers fired from different positions, creating a crossfire pattern that made it impossible for Marines to predict where shells would land. 76 direct hits cratered the runway. 3 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 2 ammunition dumps exploded. The aviation gas storage area took a near miss that ruptured 6 drums, creating a small lake of flammable liquid that the Marines had to contain before a spark ignited it. Casualties that night totaled 16 Marines killed and 31 wounded. When dawn came and the damage assessment was completed, engineers estimated 6 hours to restore the field to operational status. They achieved it in 4, working with desperation born of knowing that Japanese air raids would arrive shortly after sunrise and would find easy targets if aircraft couldn't take off. The psychological impact of the Tokyo Express created cumulative stress that affected every Marine on Guadalcanal. During daylight hours, they controlled the battlefield. They could see the enemy, engage targets, call for air support, and maneuver with confidence. But when darkness fell, they became targets in foxholes, unable to see the destroyers shelling them, unable to respond, unable to do anything except endure. Sleep became impossible during bombardments. Even when shells fell elsewhere, the noise and vibration kept everyone awake. Marines began showing signs of combat fatigue. The 1,000-yard stare, slow reaction times, irritability, difficulty concentrating. Medical officers recognized these symptoms but had no treatment to offer except rest, and rest was impossible when every night brought bombardment. The supplies that Tokyo Express destroyers landed proved as important as the troops they carried. Each destroyer run could transport 10 to 15 tons of supplies in addition to troops: rice, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts. All arrived via the nighttime runs that Marine forces couldn't interdict. Japanese troops who had evacuated into the jungle after the initial American landing were now being resupplied and reinforced systematically. By mid-September, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had grown from perhaps 600 combat troops at the time of the landing to over 8,000, with more arriving nightly. The supplies enabled these forces to remain combat effective rather than slowly starving in the jungle. The strategic situation was shifting. Instead of isolated Marines holding an airfield against a disorganized enemy, both sides were now building up forces for a major confrontation. September 12th brought intelligence that alarmed Marine commanders. Coast watchers reported a large Japanese force, estimated at 4,000 to 5,000 troops, had landed west of the Marine perimeter and was moving inland. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed the sighting, spotting troop columns marching through the jungle. This was far larger than previous Tokyo Express deliveries. Something significant was being planned. General Vandegrift ordered increased patrols and strengthened defensive positions, but the jungle made tracking large enemy formations impossible. The Japanese could move thousands of troops through the rainforest parallel to Marine positions, remaining completely invisible under the canopy. Marine commanders understood an attack was coming, but didn't know when, where, or in what strength. All they could do was prepare defenses, position reserves, and hope that when the attack came, they would be ready. The Tokyo Express runs continued with increasing frequency through late September. Sometimes destroyers came alone, sometimes in groups of 3 or 5. They varied their routes, timing, and bombardment patterns to prevent American forces from predicting their movements. Each run cratered Henderson Field, landed more troops, delivered more supplies, and withdrew before American aircraft could engage. The Marines repaired the damage each time, but the cumulative effect was exhausting. Equipment broke down from overuse. Personnel worked until they collapsed. The airfield remained operational, but only through continuous effort that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Japanese planners at Rabaul understood this. They were conducting attrition warfare. Each bombardment didn't need to permanently disable Henderson Field. It just needed to wear down the defenders incrementally. Eventually, the Marines would be too exhausted, too sick, too reduced in strength to repair the damage quickly enough. Then, a major assault would overwhelm them, and Henderson Field would fall. The question was whether the Americans could outlast the Japanese in this slow-motion siege, or whether something would break first. September 1st, 1942, Imperial Japanese Army Headquarters, Rabaul. General Harukichi Hyakutake spread maps across the conference table and studied the situation that had developed on Guadalcanal with growing concern. What was supposed to be a minor inconvenience, an American raid on an unimportant airfield, had become a strategic problem that demanded his personal attention. The Americans had somehow held Henderson Field for 3 weeks despite naval bombardment, air attacks, and the failed Ichiki assault. Intelligence reports now indicated at least 15,000 American troops on the island, not the 2,000 demoralized Marines that initial estimates had suggested. Worse, the Americans were flying combat aircraft from Henderson Field, which meant Japanese reinforcement operations were exposed to air attack during daylight hours. Hyakutake made his decision. He would commit the 35th Infantry Brigade, approximately 4,000 elite troops, to retake Guadalcanal and destroy the American garrison. The strategic context that drove this decision revealed how completely Guadalcanal had disrupted Japanese planning for the Pacific War. In September 1942, Japan was supposed to be consolidating defensive positions across the Pacific and building unsinkable carriers, island air bases, that would dominate the region. The capture of Port Moresby in New Guinea was the priority operation, with forces advancing overland through terrain considered impassable. The Solomon Islands were supposed to be a quiet backwater where engineers built airfields unmolested by American interference. Instead, the Americans had invaded Guadalcanal, threatened the entire southern Solomon chain, and forced Japan to divert substantial forces from New Guinea to deal with this unexpected crisis. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese military planners found themselves reacting to American initiatives rather than executing their own timetable. September 8th brought an even more significant decision from Tokyo itself. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo convened an imperial conference that included the emperor, military chiefs, and cabinet ministers. The subject was Guadalcanal, specifically whether Japan should commit major resources to retaking the island or write it off as an acceptable loss. The army advocated evacuation, arguing that Guadalcanal was a distraction from more important objectives in New Guinea and elsewhere. The Navy demanded a maximum effort, arguing that abandoning Guadalcanal would expose the entire Solomon Island chain to American attack and threaten the critical naval base at Rabaul. The debate lasted hours, with both sides presenting strategic arguments. Finally, Tojo made his ruling. Guadalcanal would be retaken at whatever cost necessary. This was no longer about a single airfield. This was about Japanese prestige, military credibility, and demonstrating that American offensives could be stopped and reversed. The forces assigned to the Guadalcanal operation reflected the seriousness with which Tokyo now viewed the situation. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was merely the first wave. Behind them came the 2nd Division, the 38th Division, and supporting units, eventually totaling over 20,000 troops. These were not garrison forces or construction battalions, but elite combat units with extensive combat experience in China and Manchuria. They would be equipped with artillery, tanks, and all the supplies necessary for sustained operations. The logistics were staggering, transporting 20,000 troops and their equipment across hundreds of miles of ocean, contested by American aircraft and submarines. But Tokyo had decided this must be done, and the Japanese military would find a way. September 11th brought confirmation that the Japanese buildup was accelerating. Coast watchers reported 6 large transports departing Rabaul, escorted by destroyers and cruisers, heading south toward Guadalcanal. American search aircraft from Henderson Field located the convoy the following morning and attacked repeatedly throughout the day. Dive bombers sank 1 transport and damaged 2 others, forcing the convoy to turn back. But the attempt demonstrated Japanese determination. They would continue trying until a convoy got through, and eventually one would. General Vandegrift studied the intelligence reports and understood what they meant. The Japanese were coming in force, and when they arrived, the Marines would face the largest battle of the campaign. The Japanese plan for retaking Guadalcanal revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their military thinking. General Kawaguchi would land his brigade west of the Marine perimeter, then march through the jungle to attack from the south, the direction where Marine defenses were weakest. Supporting attacks would come from the east to divide Marine forces. The assault would be coordinated with naval bombardment and air attacks to maximize pressure on American defenses. Once Henderson Field fell, reinforcements would land by transport in daylight, and the entire American force could be destroyed methodically. The plan was operationally sound, but relied on assumptions that the Ichiki disaster should have disproven, that American forces were demoralized and poorly led, that Japanese infantry could overcome firepower through superior spirit, that frontal assaults would succeed against prepared defenses. Between September 10th and September 15th, Tokyo Express runs landed approximately 4,500 additional Japanese troops west of the Marine perimeter. The troops came ashore at night, dispersed into the jungle immediately, and began the exhausting march to their attack positions. The jungle defeated them before the Marines had a chance. Kawaguchi's forces attempted to move cross-country with full equipment through terrain that was barely passable for individual soldiers, let alone formed units with heavy weapons. The jungle was so dense that visibility dropped to 10 feet in some areas. Vines tangled equipment. Swamps forced detours of miles. Rain turned streams into torrents. The troops who had landed carrying 3 days of rations quickly exhausted their food supplies. Malaria and dysentery struck immediately. What was supposed to be a 3-day march took 6 days, and units arrived at their attack positions under strength, exhausted, and already sick. Marine intelligence gathering during this period demonstrated significant advances in capability. Patrol units pushed into the jungle beyond the defensive perimeter, making contact with Japanese forces and determining their positions. Captured documents revealed attack plans and unit designations. Coast watchers reported ship movements that indicated reinforcement patterns. By September 12th, Vandegrift had a reasonably clear picture of what the Japanese intended: a 3-pronged assault with the main attack coming from the south against the ridgeline that dominated Henderson Field. He had time to prepare defenses, position reserves, and ensure that when the Japanese attacked, they would face Marines ready and waiting in fortified positions. The arrival of reinforcements for the Marine garrison on September 13th provided crucial additional strength. The 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, approximately 900 men, landed from transports during a narrow window of daylight when Japanese air attacks weren't expected. These were fresh troops who hadn't been worn down by weeks of malaria, poor rations, and nightly bombardments. Vandegrift immediately positioned them as a mobile reserve that could reinforce whichever sector came under heaviest attack. The Japanese would have numerical superiority, perhaps 10,000 attackers versus 11,000 defenders, but the Marines would have the advantage of prepared positions, interior lines of communication, and the knowledge that they were fighting for survival. September 14th brought the final intelligence piece that confirmed the attack was imminent. A Marine patrol captured a Japanese officer carrying maps and attack orders. The documents revealed that the main assault would come on September 13th, already passed, or September 14th at the latest. The maps showed attack routes through the jungle, assembly areas, and objectives. Most critically, they revealed the Japanese plan to seize a ridgeline south of Henderson Field that American forces had designated as Hill 123, but would soon become famous under a different name, Edson's Ridge, named for the Marine officer who would defend it. Vandegrift ordered the position reinforced immediately, sending Marine raiders and parachutists, elite light infantry units, to hold the ridge at all costs. Everything now depended on whether those positions could hold when the full weight of the Japanese assault fell upon them. The strategic significance of the impending battle extended far beyond Guadalcanal itself. This would be the first time in the Pacific War that major Japanese and American ground forces met in sustained combat. Previous battles had been brief: Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Bataan, Corregidor, ending in rapid Japanese victories or prolonged sieges that ended in surrender. Guadalcanal represented something new: American forces in prepared positions with adequate supplies and air support, facing Japanese forces committed to offensive operations. The outcome would shape both nations' strategic planning for the remainder of the war. If the Japanese won, they would demonstrate that American offensives could be reversed and American forces defeated in ground combat. If the Marines won, they would prove that Japanese tactical superiority was a myth and that American forces could hold positions against determined enemy assaults. The fate of Henderson Field would be decided in the next 72 hours, and with it, possibly the trajectory of the Pacific War itself. August 24th, 1942, 9:50 in the morning, 300 miles north of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander John Eldridge pushed his dauntless dive bomber into a shallow dive and stared at the sight below. A Japanese aircraft carrier zigzagging through open ocean, her flight deck empty, her escort destroyers throwing up anti-aircraft fire that dotted the sky with black puffs. The carrier was Ryujo, a light flat top carrying approximately 40 aircraft, and she was the forward element of a massive Japanese force approaching Guadalcanal. Eldridge armed his 1,000-pound bomb, rolled inverted to position his dive angle, and pulled through into a 70-degree descent. The carrier grew larger in his bomb sight. At 1,500 feet, he released. The bomb fell away, and Eldridge pulled out of his dive so hard the G-forces grayed his vision. Behind him, the bomb struck Ryujo near her forward elevator. The explosion blew a hole in the flight deck 20 feet across. Ryujo was doomed, but the Battle of Eastern Solomons was only beginning. The carrier battle that developed on August 24th represented both sides' attempt to establish naval dominance around Guadalcanal. Japanese Admiral Nobutake Kondo commanded a force built around 3 carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Ryujo, plus battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. His mission was to destroy American carrier forces, then land reinforcements on Guadalcanal under air cover from his own aircraft. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the American force built around Enterprise and Saratoga, the only operational U.S. carriers in the Pacific after losses at Coral Sea and Midway. Fletcher's mission was simpler: prevent the Japanese from reinforcing Guadalcanal and protect the Marines. The two forces had been maneuvering for position since August 23rd, each searching for the other, each waiting for the optimal moment to strike. Ryujo's destruction came at 3:30 in the afternoon when the carrier, already listing and burning from multiple bomb hits, rolled over and sank. Japanese destroyers rescued most of her crew, but the carrier and her aircraft were gone. The Americans celebrated briefly, then realized Ryujo had been a decoy. While American aircraft attacked the light carrier, Japanese strike aircraft from Shokaku and Zuikaku were inbound toward the American carriers. At 4:12 p.m., radar operators on Enterprise detected the incoming raid, approximately 60 Japanese aircraft at 40 miles and closing. Fletcher scrambled every available fighter, but there weren't enough. The Wildcats intercepted the raid and shot down several Japanese aircraft, but dozens broke through. Dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked Enterprise simultaneously from multiple directions. Enterprise twisted and turned, trying to avoid torpedoes while her anti-aircraft guns threw up a curtain of fire. 3 dive bombers scored hits in rapid succession. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded on the hangar deck, killing dozens of crew and starting fires. The second bomb struck near the aft elevator, jamming it in the up position. The third bomb detonated near the island superstructure, killing personnel and destroying radar equipment. Enterprise's damage control parties fought the fires while the carrier continued maneuvering. The ship was severely damaged but remained afloat and operational enough to recover aircraft. Saratoga escaped damage through luck and aggressive maneuvering, By 6 o'clock, the carrier battle was over. Both sides withdrew to assess damage and rearm. The strategic outcome of Eastern Solomons was ambiguous. Tactically a draw, strategically a narrow American victory. Japan had lost one carrier sunk and had approximately 90 aircraft shot down or lost operationally. The United States had suffered one carrier heavily damaged and approximately 25 aircraft lost. More importantly, the Japanese transport convoy carrying reinforcements to Guadalcanal had turned back rather than risk air attack without carrier cover. The Marines on Guadalcanal received a temporary reprieve, but the cost of that reprieve was significant. Enterprise would require months of repair, reducing American carrier strength in the Pacific to just 2 operational carriers, Saratoga and Wasp, covering the entire theater from the Aleutians to the Coral Sea. September 15th brought the disaster that American carrier forces had feared since the war began. USS Wasp, operating southeast of Guadalcanal to cover a Marine reinforcement convoy, took 3 torpedoes from Japanese submarine I-19. The carrier had been zigzagging, but submarine commander Takaichi Kinashi had predicted her movements perfectly. The torpedoes struck Wasp's fuel tanks and aviation gas storage, creating a catastrophic fire. Within minutes, the fire spread through the hangar deck, where fully fueled and armed aircraft were parked. Secondary explosions ripped through the carrier. The commanding officer, Captain Forrest Sherman, ordered the ship abandoned at 2:50 p.m. At 4 o'clock, torpedoes from American destroyers finished Wasp off to prevent her capture. 193 officers and men went down with the carrier. The same submarine spread of torpedoes also damaged battleship North Carolina and destroyer O'Brien, 3 major warships hit in a single attack. The loss of Wasp reduced American carrier strength to a single operational flat top, Saratoga, in the entire Pacific. This strategic vulnerability meant that carrier operations around Guadalcanal became impossible to sustain. Without carriers, American forces couldn't provide air cover for reinforcement convoys beyond the range of Henderson Field's aircraft. Without carriers, the Navy couldn't contest Japanese surface forces in daylight carrier actions. The entire burden of maintaining air superiority around Guadalcanal fell on the Cactus Air Force, those worn, patched aircraft operating from Henderson Field with minimal support and maximum determination. Japanese planners recognized this opportunity. With American carriers withdrawn or sunk, Japanese battleships and cruisers could operate more freely, even during daylight hours, if they accepted some risk from land-based aircraft. October 11th brought the first American attempt to stop the Tokyo Express through surface action rather than air attack. Rear Admiral Norman Scott commanded a force of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers with orders to intercept Japanese destroyers attempting to land reinforcements. Scott's force had one critical advantage: the new SG surface search radar that could detect ships at ranges beyond visual identification distance. The Battle of Cape Esperance began at 11:30 p.m. when American radar detected Japanese ships at 14 miles. For once, the Americans had tactical surprise. Scott maneuvered his cruisers to cross the Japanese T, positioning his ships perpendicular to the enemy column, allowing all American guns to bear, while only the lead Japanese ships could return fire. The brief, violent action that followed demonstrated that American forces could win night surface engagements if they detected the enemy first and maintained fire discipline. American cruisers opened fire at approximately 5,000 yards, their 6-inch and 8-inch guns hammering Japanese destroyer Fubuki and heavy cruiser Furutaka. Both Japanese ships were hit repeatedly and began burning. Japanese return fire was less effective, partially because they were still trying to determine where the American ships were. The battle lasted less than 40 minutes. When it ended, the Japanese had lost cruiser Furutaka and destroyer Fubuki sunk, plus another cruiser damaged. The Americans suffered damage to cruiser Boise and destroyer Duncan sunk. More importantly, the Tokyo Express reinforcement mission had been disrupted. Fewer troops landed than planned. Cape Esperance demonstrated that radar-directed gunfire could overcome Japanese optical superiority in night actions. But the victory came with caveats. American ships had achieved surprise through radar detection, but once the battle became general engagement, Japanese training in night combat still proved superior. American forces had to detect first, fire first, and maintain cohesion to win night battles. Any engagement that dissolved into confused individual combat favored the Japanese. The broader strategic implication was that control of the seas around Guadalcanal would remain contested. Neither side could establish permanent dominance. Americans controlled daylight through Henderson field aircraft. Japanese controlled nighttime through superior night fighting techniques. The campaign would be decided by which side could sustain this grinding attrition longer. The naval battles of August through October established the pattern that would define the Guadalcanal campaign's naval dimension. Major carrier actions demonstrated that neither side could achieve decisive victory without unacceptable losses. Surface actions proved that control of the waters around Guadalcanal would swing back and forth based on time of day, weather, and tactical circumstances. Submarines operated effectively against major warships, but couldn't decisively affect the campaign. The overall result was stalemate at sea, which meant the campaign's outcome would be determined on Guadalcanal itself. Whoever could sustain forces ashore longest would eventually win. Japanese destroyers continued running the Tokyo Express, landing reinforcements nightly despite losses. American transports continued delivering supplies during daylight hours when air cover was available. Both navies were bleeding strength in a mutual attrition campaign that neither could afford to lose, but neither could decisively win. The cumulative naval losses by October stunned planners on both sides. The United States had lost 2 carriers, Wasp and Lexington, plus 2 carriers damaged, Enterprise and Saratoga. 4 heavy cruisers had been sunk at Savo Island. Multiple destroyers had been lost. The Pacific Fleet's strength had been reduced by approximately 40% since Pearl Harbor, and most losses had occurred around Guadalcanal. Japanese losses were equally serious. 2 carriers sunk, Ryujo and Shoho, plus 1 carrier damaged. Multiple cruisers and destroyers sunk in various night actions. Most critically, Japan had lost dozens of experienced pilots, men who required years to train and couldn't be quickly replaced. Both sides were hemorrhaging naval strength at rates that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Something would have to give. Either the Americans would abandon Guadalcanal to preserve their fleet, or the Japanese would withdraw to preserve theirs. Neither option was palatable to commanders who understood that Guadalcanal had become the decisive battle that would determine the Pacific War's trajectory. September 12, 1942, dusk settling over Guadalcanal. Colonel Merritt Edson walked the length of the ridge one more time, checking fields of fire, speaking quietly with squad leaders, making sure every Marine understood what was coming. The ridge itself was unremarkable, a coral and dirt spine roughly 1,000 yards long and 200 yards wide at its base, rising about 120 feet above the surrounding jungle. But this ridge was the key terrain that dominated Henderson Field from the south. Whoever held it controlled the airfield. Edson's force, approximately 700 Marines from the 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion, was all that stood between the Japanese and the most important objective in the South Pacific. Edson gathered his officers one final time and told them simply, "They're coming tonight. If we don't hold, they take Henderson Field." The Marines defending the ridge represented the elite of the Marine Corps. The Raiders were light infantry specialists, trained for behind-the-lines operations and rapid assault missions. The parachutists were airborne infantry, equally elite and aggressive. Under Edson's command, they had been forged into a cohesive force through training and the shared experience of combat. But they were exhausted. The Raiders had conducted a diversionary raid on Tasimboko just days earlier, discovering a major Japanese supply base and confirming that a large enemy force was preparing to attack. The subsequent forced march back to the Marine perimeter had left them physically drained. Now they would defend a mile-long ridgeline with roughly 1 man every 4 yards, a defensive line so thin that any penetration might prove catastrophic. The Japanese force preparing to attack numbered approximately 3,000 soldiers of the Kawaguchi Brigade. They had spent 6 days marching through jungle that consumed their strength mile by mile. Many were suffering from malaria and dysentery. Their food supplies were nearly exhausted. But they remained combat effective and motivated by orders that emphasized this attack would determine the campaign's outcome. General Kawaguchi had positioned his forces in the jungle south of the ridge, organizing them into assault waves that would attack in succession until American defenses broke. Japanese intelligence suggested the ridge was lightly defended, perhaps by a few hundred troops. This assessment was accidentally correct. Edson's force was indeed small, but Japanese planners failed to account for American firepower, defensive positions, and artillery support. The attack began at 9 o'clock on the night of September 12th with a Japanese probe that quickly escalated into a full assault. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle and began climbing the southern slope of the ridge, their advance covered by machine gun and mortar fire. Marines in the forward positions opened fire at 50 yards, muzzle flashes illuminating targets in the darkness. The Japanese absorbed the fire and kept coming, climbing over their own dead to reach American positions. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted as Japanese soldiers broke through the thin defensive line. Marines fought with rifles, bayonets, knives, and fists in combat so close that neither side could employ supporting fires without hitting their own men. The forward Marine positions buckled but didn't break, falling back slowly while maintaining cohesion. By 10 o'clock, the situation had become desperate. Japanese forces had pushed the Marines back approximately 300 yards from their initial positions. The ridgeline's center was threatened by a penetration that had reached within 40 yards of Henderson Field's perimeter. Edson moved forward personally, exposing himself to fire while organizing a counterattack. He grabbed Marines from headquarters units, cooks, clerks, anyone with a rifle, and formed them into a scratch reserve. When a panicked Marine ran past him, Edson stopped him physically and turned him around. "The only thing they've got that we don't is guts. We've got to give them more guts than they've got." The impromptu pep talk steadied the line. Marines who had been falling back stopped, found cover, and began firing. The Japanese advance stalled. Artillery support proved decisive in breaking the Japanese assault. Marine 105mm howitzers, positioned just behind the ridge, began firing over open sights at ranges as short as 400 yards. The gunners could see Japanese soldiers illuminated by muzzle flashes and aimed directly at the concentrations. High explosive shells detonated among the attacking forces, creating carnage that even veteran Japanese soldiers couldn't endure. The artillery fire was so accurate and sustained that the southern slope of the ridge became impassable. Bodies lay heaped in windows where shells had caught groups of soldiers in the open. Japanese officers tried to rally their men for renewed assaults, but couldn't overcome the combination of machine gun fire and artillery fire that turned every advance into suicide. The second night, September 13th, brought renewed attacks with even greater intensity. General Kawaguchi committed his reserve forces, convinced that one more push would break through. At 2 o'clock in the morning, approximately 1,000 fresh Japanese soldiers assaulted the ridge from multiple directions simultaneously. This coordinated attack achieved what previous piecemeal assaults had not. It created penetrations in multiple locations that threatened to fragment the Marine defense. The center of the line collapsed, with Japanese soldiers pushing through to positions just 70 yards from Henderson Field. Marine machine gunners continued firing until Japanese infantry overran their positions and killed them at their guns. For 30 minutes, the battle hung in the balance. If the Japanese could exploit their penetration, they would roll up the Marine line and take the airfield. Edson's leadership during this crisis would earn him the Medal of Honor. Completely exposed under fire, he moved along the remaining Marine positions, physically positioning machine guns, directing fire, and refusing to withdraw, despite being within grenade range of Japanese soldiers. When a Marine officer suggested pulling back to a secondary line, Edson's response entered Marine Corps legend. "Nobody moves, we hold here." His personal example steadied Marines who were on the edge of breaking. They stopped retreating and began counterattacking, pushing Japanese soldiers back through close quarters, fighting that was medieval in its brutality. Gradually, desperately, the Marine line stabilized. By 3:30 a.m., the Japanese penetration had been contained. By dawn, Japanese forces were withdrawing back into the jungle, leaving behind nearly 900 dead. The butcher's bill from the two-night battle shocked both sides. Edson's force of 700 Marines had suffered 104 killed and 140 wounded, nearly 35% casualties. Japanese casualties were catastrophic, approximately 900 dead confirmed, hundreds more wounded. The Kawaguchi Brigade had ceased to exist as an effective combat unit. More importantly, the assault had failed completely. Henderson Field remained in American hands. The ridgeline that dominated it was held by Marines who had proven they could absorb the best the Japanese army could throw at them and hold their ground. The tactical lessons of Edson's Ridge reinforced patterns that had emerged at Tenaru, but on a larger scale. Japanese frontal assaults, no matter how determined, could not overcome prepared American defensive positions supported by coordinated fires. The Japanese had achieved surprise and timing, and some success in initial penetrations, but they lacked the ability to exploit success because their tactical doctrine didn't emphasize combined arms coordination. Artillery support was minimal because they had abandoned heavy weapons during the Jungle March. Air support was non-existent because Henderson Field's aircraft controlled daylight skies. The result was pure infantry assault against positions defended by infantry, machine guns, and artillery. A contest that American firepower would win every time. The strategic significance of the Ridge Battle extended beyond its immediate tactical outcome. The Japanese had committed their best troops in a carefully planned assault and had been decisively defeated. This wasn't a meeting engagement or hasty attack, but a deliberate offensive operation with adequate time for planning and positioning forces. The failure demonstrated that Japanese tactics, emphasizing spirit, shock, and close combat, were fundamentally inadequate against American defensive doctrine. Future Japanese attacks would follow the same pattern and achieve the same results: high casualties, minimal gains, eventual defeat. Edson's Ridge established that the Marines could hold Guadalcanal against conventional Japanese ground assault, which meant the campaign's outcome would be determined by logistics and attrition rather than by dramatic battlefield victory. October 20th, 1942, deep in the jungle south of Henderson Field. Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama stood in ankle-deep mud and studied maps that were disintegrating in the constant rain. His force, the 2nd Division, 9,000 of Japan's finest soldiers, had been marching through this green hell for 3 days, and they had covered perhaps 8 miles. The plan had seemed reasonable in the briefing rooms at Rabaul: land west of the American perimeter, march inland through the jungle, approach Henderson Field from the south where defenses were weakest, and attack in overwhelming force. Reality had proven different. The jungle wasn't just difficult terrain. It was an active enemy that consumed equipment, destroyed morale, and killed men without the Americans firing a shot. Maruyama's columns had already abandoned 11 artillery pieces that sank axle deep in swamps. Soldiers were collapsing from heat exhaustion and malaria. The 3-day march would take 6 days, and they would arrive at the battlefield already defeated by the terrain they had crossed. The October offensive represented Japan's maximum effort to retake Guadalcanal through conventional military operations. Tokyo had committed the 2nd Division, 17,000 troops total when combined with supporting units already on the island, plus provided naval and air support that would coordinate with the ground assault. The plan was operationally elegant. Diversionary attacks from the east would draw Marine reserves. Then Maruyama's main force would assault from the south through the same ridge complex where Edson had fought in September. Once Henderson Field fell, Japanese transports could land in daylight under air cover from captured airfield facilities. The Americans would be cut off, surrounded, and systematically destroyed. Every senior Japanese officer from General Hyakutake down to battalion commanders understood this was the decisive battle. Either they would retake Guadalcanal in October, or they would lose it permanently. The American defensive position had been substantially strengthened since September. Marine strength on Guadalcanal now exceeded 23,000 troops, including the newly arrived 7th Marines and elements of the Army's 164th Infantry Regiment. The arrival of Army troops was psychologically significant. It demonstrated that the defense of Guadalcanal was a national priority, not just a Marine operation. The defensive perimeter had been expanded and fortified with improved fighting positions, more barbed wire, better fields of fire cleared through the jungle, and pre-registered artillery targets covering all likely avenues of approach. General Vandegrift had learned from Edson's Ridge that the Japanese would continue using frontal assault tactics, so he prepared defenses optimized to defeat those tactics through coordinated firepower. October 23rd brought the first sign that the Japanese offensive was beginning. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Japanese artillery opened fire on Marine positions east of the perimeter, the first sustained artillery bombardment the Marines had experienced. The Japanese had managed to bring forward several artillery batteries that had been laboriously manhandled through the jungle. The bombardment lasted 30 minutes, and while it caused minimal casualties due to Marines taking cover, it signaled that coordinated operations were underway. Vandegrift alerted all units to prepare for attack. Intelligence reports from coast watchers and aerial reconnaissance had provided warning that a large Japanese force was approaching, but the exact timing and location remained uncertain until the guns started firing. The diversionary attack hit at 9 o'clock that night against positions held by the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. Approximately 2,000 Japanese troops assaulted across the Mattered River in an attempt to break through Marine lines. The attack was well executed, with Japanese infantry crossing the river under cover of machine gun fire and mortar support. They achieved initial penetrations that threatened Marine positions, but Army and Marine artillery responded within minutes, dropping concentrations that shattered the Japanese assault formations. By midnight, the attack had been repulsed with heavy Japanese casualties. The diversionary attack had failed to draw away significant Marine reserves, partially because Vandegrift suspected this wasn't the main effort and refused to commit his mobile reserve until the situation clarified. Maruyama's main assault began at midnight on October 24th, but it began in confusion and disarray. His forces had finally reached their attack positions after 6 days of jungle marching that left them exhausted and hungry. Many soldiers hadn't eaten in 2 days because supply columns had fallen behind during the march. Disease rates exceeded 30%. The 9,000 troops who had started the march had been reduced to perhaps 6,000 combat-effective soldiers. Worse, the jungle approach march had fragmented the division into separated columns that arrived at different times. Maruyama's plan called for coordinated simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Instead, units attacked piecemeal as they arrived at the battlefield, allowing Marines to concentrate fires against each attack in sequence. The fighting that developed south of Henderson Field through the night of October 24th resembled Edson's Ridge, but on a larger scale with even more desperate intensity. Japanese soldiers assaulted Marine positions in waves, climbing through barbed wire while machine guns cut them down, advancing over bodies of their own, dead to reach American foxholes. Individual penetrations achieved depth of up to 70 yards before being stopped by counterattacks or artillery fire. Marines in some sectors ran out of ammunition and fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, and captured Japanese weapons. The volume of fire was so intense that machine gun barrels overheated and warped, requiring weapons to be abandoned until they cooled enough to function. Still, the Japanese came, wave after wave, following orders that demanded they break through regardless of casualties. By 3 o'clock in the morning, on October 25th, the critical moment arrived. Japanese forces achieved a penetration approximately 100 yards wide and 70 yards deep that broke completely through the Marine lines south of Henderson Field. For 30 minutes, Japanese infantry had a clear path to the airfield, with no American forces between them and their objective. But the breakthrough came at the cost of unit cohesion. The assault forces that achieved penetration were disorganized groups of soldiers from different units, without effective command structure, without supporting weapons, and without follow-on forces to exploit the gap they had created. Marine reserves counterattacked immediately. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The counterattack was brutal and effective, pushing Japanese forces back through close-quarters combat that sometimes involved fighting over the same foxholes 3 or 4 times. Dawn on October 25th revealed the magnitude of the Japanese failure. Bodies lay in heaps across the entire southern perimeter, literally piled on top of each other, in some locations where assault waves had bunched up under machine gun fire. Marines counted more than 1,500 Japanese dead in front of their positions, and that was only the bodies they could see. Many more lay in the jungle where they had crawled after being wounded. The stench became overwhelming as tropical heat began decomposition within hours. Burial parties worked through the day using bulldozers to dig mass graves because individual burials were impossible given the numbers. Marine casualties totaled approximately 250 killed and wounded, serious losses, but nothing approaching the catastrophic Japanese figures. The continuation of fighting through October 26th demonstrated Japanese tactical inflexibility taken to its ultimate extreme. Despite catastrophic losses on the first night, Maruyama ordered renewed attacks the second night, following the same tactics at the same locations. Fresh assault waves climbed over bodies from the previous night's attacks and met the same fate: machine gun fire and artillery fire that killed them before they reached American positions. Japanese officers continued leading their men forward with swords drawn, exhibiting personal courage that was undeniable and tactical stupidity that was equally clear. By dawn on October 27th, another 2,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed in attacks that gained nothing. The 2nd Division had effectively ceased to exist as a combat formation. Of 17,000 troops committed to the October offensive, fewer than 8,000 would survive to withdraw into the jungle. The naval component of the October offensive achieved only marginally better results. Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna conducted a nighttime bombardment of Henderson Field on October 13th that was the most devastating of the campaign. 914-inch shells cratered the runway and destroyed facilities. The bombardment was so intense that Marines called it the bombardment. No other needed to be specified. Yet within 24 hours, Henderson Field was operational again. Japanese planners had underestimated American engineering capability and Marine determination to keep the airfield functional regardless of damage. Every shell crater was filled, every damaged facility repaired or bypassed, every destroyed aircraft replaced by reinforcements flown in from escort carriers. The strategic calculation that had driven the October offensive was revealed as fundamentally flawed. Japanese planners had assumed that sufficient force applied at a single point would break American defenses, and that once Henderson Field fell, American forces would collapse or surrender. Neither assumption proved correct. American defensive positions had depth. Even major penetrations could be contained and eliminated through counterattack. Henderson Field's operational capability was maintained through continuous repair rather than being destroyed by any single bombardment. Most critically, American morale remained high despite losses because Marines could see reinforcements arriving, supplies being delivered, and aircraft operating from Henderson Field. The Japanese were the ones whose situation was deteriorating, not the Americans. By November 1st, General Hyaku Take at Rabaul was forced to acknowledge reality. The October offensive had failed completely. 17,000 Japanese troops had been committed to the attack. Casualties exceeded 9,000 killed and wounded. The survivors were scattered through the jungle south of Henderson Field, starving, diseased, and combat ineffective. Henderson Field remained firmly in American hands. Marine casualties had been serious but sustainable, approximately 800 killed and wounded total. Most importantly, American reinforcements and supplies continued arriving, while Japanese reinforcement efforts were increasingly costly and ineffective. For the first time since the war began, a major Japanese offensive operation had been decisively defeated on the ground. The psychological impact in Tokyo was profound. If Japan's best divisions couldn't retake a single airfield from American forces, what did that imply about the ultimate outcome of the Pacific War? November 12, 1942, 11:58 at night. Ensign John Harper stood on the bridge of USS Atlanta and watched green-white flares suddenly illuminate the darkness ahead. Japanese ships, multiple contacts at less than 5,000 yards and closing fast. Before Harper could process what he was seeing, searchlights snapped on from the Japanese vessels, turning night into day and fixing Atlanta in brilliant light. The first salvo arrived 3 seconds later. 14-inch shells from battleship High AC smashed into Atlanta's superstructure at point-blank range. The light cruiser simply disintegrated under the impact. Her bridge was destroyed instantly, killing Admiral Norman Scott and most of the command staff. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as ammunition magazines detonated. Atlanta was dead in the water and burning stem to stern within 2 minutes of the battle beginning. Harper, thrown clear by an explosion, found himself in water that was already filling with debris, oil, and bodies. Above him, the greatest naval battle in history was just beginning. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 3 days from November 12th through November 15th, represented the climax of the naval campaign and would determine whether Japan could sustain forces on Guadalcanal or whether American sea control would strangle Japanese operations. The immediate trigger was a Japanese transport convoy carrying 7,000 troops and massive supplies to reinforce the battered garrison. Admiral Hiroaki Abe commanded the escort force, 2 battleships, 1 light cruiser, and 14 destroyers, with orders to bombard Henderson Field into permanent non-operation, then cover the transport's landing. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan commanded the American force, 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, with orders to stop the Japanese bombardment force at all costs. The forces met almost accidentally in the confined waters north of Guadalcanal, and the resulting action was the most confused and brutal surface engagement of the Pacific War. The opening moments of the battle dissolved into chaos that neither side could control. Ships passed so close they couldn't depress their guns far enough to fire at each other. Destroyers rammed cruisers. Torpedoes launched at one target hit different ships entirely. Friend or foe identification became impossible in the darkness, with searchlights stabbing in all directions and gun flashes illuminating random segments of the battle. USS San Francisco and battleship High AI found themselves at ranges under 3,000 yards, trading broadsides that would have been more appropriate to Nelson's era than modern naval warfare. San Francisco's 8-inch shells penetrated High AI's superstructure, starting fires and destroying the steering mechanism. High AI's 14-inch shells tore San Francisco apart, killing Admiral Callahan on the bridge and most of his staff. The battle reached its crescendo at 1:15 a.m. when every ship on both sides seemed to be firing at every other ship simultaneously. Tracers crossed in the air like deadly spider webs. Torpedoes churned through the water, hitting intended targets and random victims with equal frequency. Destroyers dueled with battleships. Cruisers fought cruisers at ranges measured in hundreds of yards. The darkness was broken by gun flashes, searchlights, burning ships, and exploding magazines. Communications were impossible. Radio channels were jammed with conflicting orders, damage reports, and calls for help. Commanders lost track of their own ships, let alone enemy vessels. The battle became individual ship actions rather than coordinated fleet engagement. And in such circumstances, crew training and ship design mattered more than tactical brilliance. By 2:30 a.m., both sides had suffered catastrophic losses, and the battle was winding down through mutual exhaustion rather than decisive victory. The Americans had lost destroyers. Cushing, Laffey, Barton, and Monson sunk outright. Atlanta was sinking. San Francisco and Portland were heavily damaged and barely afloat. Juneau had taken torpedo damage that would prove fatal when a Japanese submarine finished her off the next day. Japanese losses included battleship Hiei crippled and ultimately sunk by air attack, destroyers Akatsuki and Udachi Sungsi, several other destroyers damaged. More importantly, Admiral Abe withdrew his bombardment force without accomplishing his primary mission. Henderson Field remained operational. The transport convoy, left without adequate protection, turned back rather than risk approaching Guadalcanal in daylight under American air attack. November 13th brought desperate Japanese attempts to salvage something from the disaster. Admiral Mikawa led 8 cruisers in a high-speed run to bombard Henderson Field that night. The bombardment was effective. Nearly 1,000 8-inch shells cratered the airfield and destroyed facilities, but couldn't permanently disable operations. More significant was the approach of 11 Japanese transports carrying the 7,000 reinforcements that the naval battle was supposed to protect. The transports were attempting a daylight run under air cover from Rabaul, gambling that they could beach themselves and unload before American aircraft destroyed them. It was a calculated desperation move that demonstrated how critical Japanese commanders viewed the Guadalcanal situation. Henderson Field's aircraft launched everything that could fly against the Japanese transport convoy on November 14th. Wildcats, Dauntlesses, Army Air Forces, B-17 bombers, Navy Avenger torpedo bombers, every available aircraft attacked the slow-moving transports throughout the day. The slaughter was methodical and terrible. One by one, the transports were hit, set afire, and sunk or forced to beach themselves on Guadalcanal's western shore. Of 11 transports, only 4 survived to beach themselves, and even those continued burning as they unloaded. Japanese troops waded ashore under continuous air attack, abandoning most of their heavy equipment and supplies in the burning ships. Perhaps 4,000 troops made it ashore alive, but they arrived without artillery, with minimal ammunition, and without the food supplies that might have sustained them. It was a Pyrrhic landing that reinforced failure rather than enabling success. The final act of the 3-day battle came on the night of November 14th through 15th. Admiral Willis Lee commanded American battleships Washington and South Dakota, supported by 4 destroyers, with orders to intercept another Japanese bombardment force approaching Guadalcanal. This force included battleship Kirishima and supporting cruisers and destroyers. The resulting action demonstrated how much American night fighting capability had improved since the Savo Island disaster. Washington's radar detected the Japanese force at 18,000 yards, far beyond visual range and darkness. Lee maneuvered his battleships into firing position while maintaining radar track of the enemy. At midnight, Washington opened fire, her 9 16-inch guns hurling shells that outweighed entire automobiles at the enemy formation. Kirishima never had a chance. Washington's radar-directed fire was devastatingly accurate at ranges where Japanese optical systems couldn't even see their target. 9 16-inch shells struck Kirishima in 7 minutes, each impact creating massive damage. The battleship's superstructure was wrecked, her steering destroyed, fires burning throughout the ship. She was dead in the water and sinking by 12:20 a.m. Japanese destroyers launched torpedoes in Washington's general direction, but without effective fire control, their attacks were ineffective. By 1 o'clock, the Japanese force was withdrawing, leaving Kirishima behind to sink. American losses included 4 destroyers damaged or sunk, acceptable casualties given that a Japanese battleship had been destroyed and the bombardment mission prevented. The strategic outcome of the naval battle of Guadalcanal was decisive in ways that tactical victories at Midway or Coral Sea had not been. Japanese forces had attempted their maximum effort to sustain operations on Guadalcanal and had been defeated across every dimension. The transport convoy was destroyed. The bombardment forces were repulsed with heavy losses. 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, were sunk, representing enormous material loss that Japan couldn't easily replace. More importantly, Japanese naval commanders recognized they couldn't sustain these loss rates. Further major operations around Guadalcanal risked destroying the combined fleet without achieving objectives. The decision to withdraw from Guadalcanal wasn't made explicitly in November, but the naval battle made that decision inevitable by demonstrating that Japan could no longer contest American control of the waters around the island. The waters north of Guadalcanal had earned their grim nickname, Iron Bottom Sound, through the accumulation of wrecks that littered the seafloor. By mid-November, 49 warships from both sides lay on the bottom, in an area roughly 30 miles across. American losses included 2 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. Japanese losses included 2 battleships, 1 carrier, 4 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Nearly 8,000 sailors from both nations had died in these waters, more than would die in many entire campaigns of the war. The concentration of naval combat was unprecedented. More major warships were sunk around Guadalcanal than in any other single campaign of World War II, including the Atlantic U-boat war. The Sound had been christened in blood and steel, a maritime graveyard that testified to how desperately both sides fought for control of one jungle-covered island. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the naval battles represented distant thunder that determined their fate without their participation. They could hear the rumble of naval gunfire at night. They could see flashes on the horizon. They could watch ships burning in the distance, but they couldn't affect the outcome. Their survival depended on admirals and captains they would never meet, fighting battles they couldn't observe, making tactical decisions that would determine whether supplies arrived or whether Japanese battleships bombarded them into oblivion. The final outcome of the November naval battles brought cautious relief. Supplies were flowing more regularly. Reinforcements continued arriving. Japanese bombardments were decreasing in frequency and intensity. Something had shifted in the campaign's momentum, though the Marines on the ground couldn't yet know how decisively the naval battles had determined the campaign's outcome. December 1st, 1942, Japanese Field Hospital, Western Guadalcanal. Major Toshiro Nakamura knelt beside soldiers who were dying, not from American bullets, but from malnutrition, so severe their bodies were consuming themselves. Beriberi had swollen their legs to grotesque proportions. Scurvy had rotted their gums and loosened their teeth. Dysentery had reduced them to skeletal figures too weak to walk. The official ration was 1/3 cup of rice per day per man, approximately 200 calories when soldiers needed 3,000 to function. Resupply had virtually ceased. The last Tokyo Express run had delivered minimal food 3 weeks earlier. Nakamura had watched disease and starvation reduce the once proud Japanese garrison from 20,000 combat-effective troops to perhaps 8,000 men capable of holding a rifle. The Americans hadn't defeated them through superior tactics or firepower. They had defeated them through logistics, by interdicting Japanese supply lines while maintaining their own. Guadalcanal had become a starvation campaign, and the Japanese were losing. The supply statistics that emerged from late 1942 tell a story of systemic logistical collapse. In November, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal required approximately 60 tons of supplies daily to maintain combat effectiveness: food, ammunition, medical supplies, equipment. Tokyo Express runs delivered approximately 18 tons daily, 30% of requirements. In December, requirements remained 60 tons, while deliveries dropped to 6 tons daily, 10% of requirements. By January, deliveries effectively ceased entirely. American submarines and aircraft had made the supply route so costly that Japanese commanders were reluctant to risk ships. The garrison that was supposed to retake Henderson Field was instead starving to death in the jungle, watching their combat effectiveness evaporate through malnutrition and disease. American supply operations, by contrast, improved steadily throughout late 1942. Henderson Field's continued operation allowed supplies to be flown in by transport aircraft when weather permitted. More importantly, American naval control during daylight hours meant transport ships could approach Guadalcanal, unload, and withdraw with acceptable risk. By December, 6 transports per week were reaching Guadalcanal compared to 1 per week in August. Each transport delivered hundreds of tons of supplies: food, ammunition, medical supplies, construction equipment. The Marines were still on short rations and still suffering from malaria, but they were fed, equipped, and supplied adequately to maintain combat operations. The contrast with Japanese forces was stark and growing more extreme weekly. The medical comparison between the two forces revealed the campaign's true nature as attrition warfare. Marine casualties from combat totaled approximately 1,500 killed and 3,000 wounded through December. Marine non-combat casualties from disease totaled approximately 5,000. Mostly malaria cases that temporarily incapacitated men, but allowed them to return to duty after treatment. Quinine supplies, while never adequate, were sufficient to treat malaria cases and prevent death in most instances. Japanese combat casualties were similar to American, perhaps 2,000 killed and 4,000 wounded, but Japanese non-combat casualties were catastrophic. Malaria rates exceeded 90%, with no quinine available for treatment. Dysentery and tropical diseases ravaged troops who lacked medical care. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making every infection potentially fatal. Of 30,000 Japanese troops who had been on Guadalcanal at various times, only 12,000 remained combat-capable by January. The rest were dead, evacuated as casualties, or incapacitated by disease and starvation. December 9th brought the first confirmed reports of Japanese soldiers dying purely from starvation rather than combat or disease. Marine patrols discovered bodies in the jungle that showed no wounds but clear signs of advanced malnutrition. Intelligence officers interrogated Japanese prisoners who confirmed that food supplies had effectively ceased. Some units were attempting to live off the jungle, eating roots, grubs, whatever they could find. But Guadalcanal's jungle was poor in edible plants, and Japanese soldiers lacked the knowledge to identify what was safe. Some died from eating poisonous plants. Others simply starved because they couldn't find anything edible. The garrison was trapped on an island without adequate food and without any prospect of resupply, slowly dying from hunger. The Japanese soldiers' experience on Guadalcanal in late 1942 was a descent into hell that bore little resemblance to the heroic combat they had expected. Soldiers who had trained for offensive operations found themselves hiding in the jungle, too weak from hunger to fight, watching comrades die from preventable diseases. Unit cohesion dissolved as individual survival became paramount. Soldiers desperate for food would steal from comrades. Officers lost authority over men who were too sick or too hungry to follow orders. The vaunted Japanese military discipline that had conquered much of Asia broke down under conditions that reduced soldiers to their most basic survival instincts. American Marines who encountered Japanese positions in December described finding soldiers who were so weak they couldn't run away, who surrendered because they lacked the strength to fight, who begged for food rather than seeking combat. January 3rd, 1943, brought intelligence that shocked American commanders even though they had suspected the truth. A captured Japanese message revealed that General Hyakutake at Rabaul estimated 70% of his Guadalcanal garrison was hospitalized or dying of malnutrition and disease. Only 30% remained combat effective. And even that figure was optimistic given the advanced state of malnutrition throughout the force. The message requested permission to evacuate the garrison before complete annihilation occurred. This was the first indication that Japan was considering withdrawal, a strategic admission that Guadalcanal could not be held, and that preserving the garrison remnants was more important than continuing futile offensive operations. Marine patrols probing west beyond their defensive perimeter in early January encountered scenes that revealed the extent of Japanese collapse. On January 10th, a patrol discovered an abandoned Japanese field hospital in the jungle. 400 men lay on crude bamboo litters, too weak to evacuate themselves when their medical staff withdrew. Most were unconscious or delirious from fever. Their legs and feet were swollen from beriberi to the point where skin split open. Wounds had become infected and gangrenous without medicine to treat them. The Marines called for medical evacuation and treated the Japanese wounded as best they could, but many died despite American medical care because they were simply too far gone to save. The patrol commander's report described conditions as worse than any hell I could imagine. The contrast in supply situations created a fundamental strategic asymmetry that determined the campaign's outcome. American forces could be reinforced and supplied more or less at will during daylight hours. Japanese forces could be reinforced and supplied only by costly, limited-capacity destroyer runs that were increasingly interdicted by American aircraft and submarines. Over time, this asymmetry meant American strength grew while Japanese strength diminished. By January, American forces on Guadalcanal exceeded 50,000 troops, Army and Marine units rotating through the island. Japanese forces had been reduced to perhaps 12,000 combat-capable troops, and that number was declining daily through attrition. The strategic balance had shifted decisively, and Japanese commanders at Rabaul recognized what American commanders on Guadalcanal were beginning to suspect. The campaign was essentially over, and Japan had lost. The question facing Japanese imperial headquarters in Tokyo was no longer whether they could hold Guadalcanal, but whether they could evacuate their garrison before complete annihilation. Every additional week that Japanese forces remained on the island meant hundreds more would die from starvation and disease. Every reinforcement sent would simply add to the number of troops who would eventually need evacuation or who would die on the island. The brutal calculus suggested that cutting losses through immediate evacuation would save thousands of lives compared to continued operations. But evacuation meant admitting defeat, something Japanese military culture and national propaganda made extremely difficult. The decision would take weeks to finalize, and during those weeks, thousands more Japanese soldiers would die, not in combat, but from hunger, disease, and the systematic logistical strangulation that American forces had imposed. For American commanders, the realization that they had won the campaign came gradually, rather than in a single moment of clarity. There was no decisive battle that ended Japanese resistance. Instead, there was the slow recognition that Japanese forces were no longer capable of offensive operations, that Japanese supply lines had collapsed, that time was working entirely in favor of American forces. General Vandegrift, who would be replaced in December by Army General Alexander Patch, could see the trajectory clearly. Japanese strength was declining, while American strength grew. Henderson field operations were routine rather than desperate. Supply ships arrived regularly. Reinforcements came in full divisions rather than battered battalions. The Marines had held long enough for American industrial and logistical superiority to manifest itself on Guadalcanal. And now that superiority was decisive. The island that nobody wanted in July had become American by January, not through a single dramatic victory, but through the grinding mathematics of supply tonnage and casualty rates. December 26, 1942. Imperial Japanese Army Headquarters, Rabaul. General Harukichi Hyakutake stood before a map of Guadalcanal, covered in markers that told a story of disaster. Red markers showed Japanese positions, scattered clusters concentrated west of the American perimeter, fragmented and isolated. Blue markers showed American strength, a solid mass that grew weekly with reinforcements. Casualty figures lined the edges of the map, 25,000 Japanese dead or missing on Guadalcanal since August. Hyakutake had drafted the message he had been avoiding for weeks. Addressed to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the message was brief and devastating. The garrison on Guadalcanal cannot be sustained. Request permission to evacuate all forces immediately. Sending the message represented the hardest decision of Hyakutake's career because it meant admitting what Japanese military culture considered unthinkable: defeat. The internal debate within Imperial General Headquarters during late December revealed deep divisions about how to respond to the Guadalcanal disaster. The Army advocated immediate evacuation, arguing that preserving trained soldiers was more important than holding one island. Every day that troops remained on Guadalcanal meant more would die from starvation and disease. Better to evacuate now, while some combat-effective strength remained, than wait until only corpses were left to recover. The Navy countered that evacuation would expose Rabaul to American attack and potentially unravel the entire defensive perimeter Japan had established across the South Pacific. If Guadalcanal fell, what would stop the Americans from advancing north through the Solomons? Where would the next defensive line be established? How could such a defeat be explained to the Japanese people who had been told the war was going well? December 31st brought an imperial conference attended by Emperor Hirohito himself, the first time the emperor had personally involved himself in operational decision-making since the war began. Prime Minister Tojo presented the situation factually. Guadalcanal had consumed enormous resources without achieving objectives. American strength was growing, while Japanese strength diminished. The supply line to Guadalcanal could not be sustained against American air and submarine interdiction. Continued operations would result in the complete loss of forces currently on the island with no prospect of victory. The Army Chief of Staff recommended evacuation. The Navy Chief of Staff reluctantly concurred, acknowledging that further naval operations around Guadalcanal would destroy the combined fleet without changing the outcome. The Emperor listened to the arguments, then gave his approval for evacuation. It was the first Japanese strategic retreat of the Pacific War. January 4th, 1943, brought the formal orders designating the evacuation as Operation KE. Vice Admiral Shiro Takasu would command naval forces responsible for extracting approximately 32,000 Japanese troops from Guadalcanal under fire and under American observation. The operational challenges were staggering. Destroyers would have to approach Guadalcanal during darkness, embark troops from beaches, and withdraw before dawn. Exactly the reverse of the Tokyo Express runs that had been landing troops for months. The difference was that now American forces would be watching for any evacuation attempt. If Marines realized what was happening, they could concentrate artillery on the embarkation beaches and slaughter Japanese troops waiting to board destroyers. The entire operation depended on deception, making the Americans believe that destroyer runs were delivering reinforcements rather than extracting the garrison. The political challenge of announcing evacuation to the Japanese public required careful propaganda management. The government couldn't admit defeat, but it needed to explain why Japanese forces were withdrawing from an island that newspapers had been describing as strategically critical for months. The solution was semantic camouflage. Official announcements would describe the movement as advancing to the rear or strategic redeployment. Newspaper articles would emphasize that Japanese forces had accomplished their objectives and were now moving to more important positions. The fiction would be maintained that Guadalcanal had been a tactical victory even as everyone with military knowledge understood it was a strategic disaster. The propaganda campaign began in early January, preparing Japanese civilians for news that would come in February. The orders that reached commanders on Guadalcanal on January 10th shocked officers who had been preparing for renewed offensive operations. Colonel Matsuda, commanding one of the few remaining intact battalions, read the evacuation order 3 times to ensure he understood correctly. His unit would march to Cape Esperance on the northwest tip of Guadalcanal, where destroyers would evacuate them during the first week of February. Until then, they were to maintain defensive positions and give no indication that withdrawal was planned. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had endured months of starvation and disease now learned they were being evacuated, but they would have to survive several more weeks before rescue arrived. Some were too sick to make the march to the evacuation beaches. Those men would be left behind to die or surrender because Japan lacked resources to evacuate everyone. The ethical calculations implicit in Operation KE revealed the brutal arithmetic of military retreat. Japanese planners estimated that 32,000 troops remained on Guadalcanal, but only perhaps 13,000 were physically capable of marching to the embarkation beaches. The rest, sick, wounded, or too weak from malnutrition, would have to be abandoned. Medical officers distributed what few supplies they had to these men and told them they were being left in a field hospital that would be evacuated later. Everyone understood this was a lie. The men being left behind would die from their wounds or disease, or would be captured by advancing Americans. This abandonment violated Japanese military culture that emphasized never abandoning wounded comrades. But operational reality left no choice. The destroyers had limited capacity, and every space aboard would be needed for soldiers who could potentially return to combat. January 15th brought the first concrete indication that American intelligence was detecting something unusual in Japanese behavior. Radio intercepts showed increased encrypted traffic between Rabaul and Guadalcanal. Aerial reconnaissance reported Japanese forces withdrawing from forward positions and concentrating near Cape Esperance. Some marine patrols reported encountering abandoned Japanese positions that had been occupied days earlier. Intelligence officers debated what this meant. Some argued the Japanese were simply consolidating before another offensive. Others suggested they might be evacuating, but this seemed unlikely given Japanese military culture that emphasized holding positions to the death. The debate remained unresolved, and American commanders prepared for continued combat rather than expecting Japanese withdrawal. The deception plan that would mask Operation KE's true nature was elegant in its simplicity. Japanese destroyers would continue conducting Tokyo Express runs on the same schedule they had maintained for months. But instead of landing troops and supplies, they would extract troops during the brief periods offshore. To American observers, destroyer runs would look exactly like reinforcement operations, ships approaching at night, remaining offshore briefly, then withdrawing before dawn. Only if American forces physically observed troops boarding rather than disembarking would the deception fail. Japanese planners counted on darkness, distance, and American assumptions to prevent detection. They were correct. American intelligence would not realize that evacuation was underway until after it had succeeded. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal represented a psychological turning point, as significant as any battlefield defeat. For the first time, Japanese military planners acknowledged that American forces could not be dislodged once established in defensive positions with adequate supply lines. For the first time, Japan would voluntarily surrender territory it had captured. For the first time, the myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, would be officially abandoned, even if the admission was disguised through propaganda. Emperor Hirohito's approval of evacuation represented personal acknowledgement that the war was not going according to plan, that Japanese forces could be defeated, that American industrial and military power was beginning to manifest itself in ways that Japanese planning had not anticipated. The evacuation order was a military decision, but it carried implications that extended far beyond Guadalcanal itself. Japan was transitioning from offense to defense, from expansion to consolidation, from winning to simply trying not to lose too badly. January 10, 1943, 2 miles west of Henderson Field, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller crouched at the edge of a coconut grove and studied the Japanese positions ahead through binoculars. His battalion, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, was spearheading the first sustained American offensive operation on Guadalcanal, advancing west to clear remaining Japanese forces from the island. Puller had expected fierce resistance, prepared defenses, the kind of desperate fighting that had characterized previous Guadalcanal battles. Instead, he found abandoned positions, half-constructed fortifications, and an eerie absence of enemy contact. His Marines had advanced 3 miles in 2 days. Extraordinary progress compared to the yard-by-yard fighting they'd expected. Something was wrong, but Puller couldn't determine what. The Japanese were retreating, and retreating was something Japanese forces didn't do. The 2nd Marine Division's arrival in January transformed the strategic situation on Guadalcanal from defensive stalemate to overwhelming American superiority. 9,000 fresh troops landed on January 10th, bringing total American strength on the island to approximately 50,000 combat troops. These weren't exhausted, malaria-ridden survivors of months of jungle warfare, but fully equipped, healthy units ready for sustained offensive operations. General Alexander Patch, commanding 14th Corps, could now conduct operations that had been impossible months earlier. Simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, deep penetration patrols, aggressive pursuit of retreating enemy forces. The Marines and Army units that had defended Henderson Field for months would now take the offensive and drive Japanese forces from the island entirely. January 15th brought the first unsettling discoveries that suggested the Japanese collapse was even more complete than American intelligence had estimated. Puller's advancing battalion discovered a Japanese campsite that had been abandoned so recently that cooking fires were still burning. Rice remained in cooking pots. Equipment was scattered everywhere: rifles, machine guns, ammunition, medical supplies. Marines examined the abandoned material and found something disturbing. Most of the equipment was broken or damaged beyond field repair. These weren't combat losses, but signs of an army disintegrating from within. Rifles had been abandoned because soldiers were too weak to carry them. Machine guns were left behind because crews had died or become incapacitated. Medical supplies were discarded because there were no medical personnel left to administer them. January 22nd brought the discovery that would reveal the true horror of the Japanese situation. Puller's Marines approached a Japanese field hospital that aerial reconnaissance had spotted days earlier. They expected a defended position requiring assault. Instead, they found approximately 600 Japanese soldiers lying on the ground, too weak to move or defend themselves. Most were unconscious or delirious from fever. Many had advanced beriberi, with legs swollen so grotesquely the skin had split open. Wounds were infected and gangrenous. The stench was overwhelming: gangrene, dysentery, unwashed bodies, death. Marine medical personnel examined the Japanese wounded and determined that many were beyond saving. They had been without food for weeks, without medicine for longer. Their bodies were consuming themselves. Several died while Marines were attempting to provide medical care, their malnutrition so advanced that even immediate treatment came too late. The advance westward revealed a pattern that repeated at every Japanese position. Abandoned equipment, scattered supplies, occasionally a handful of Japanese soldiers too sick to withdraw with their units. Marine burial details counted Japanese dead as they advanced, bodies that showed no combat wounds but clear signs of starvation and disease. Intelligence officers compiled statistics that told the story. Of approximately 30,000 Japanese troops who had been on Guadalcanal at various points during the campaign, perhaps 23,000 had died. Of those deaths, fewer than 8,000 were from combat. The rest had died from disease, malnutrition, and the collapse of Japanese logistics. Guadalcanal hadn't been primarily a combat victory, but a logistical victory. American forces had maintained their supply lines, while Japanese supply lines collapsed completely. January 30th brought Puller's battalion to Tassafaronga on Guadalcanal's western coast. The village had been a major Japanese base, used for Tokyo Express landings and supply operations. Marines expected to find fortified positions and determine resistance. Instead, they found abandoned bunkers and more evidence of Japanese retreat. But unlike previous abandoned positions, Tassafaronga showed signs of organized withdrawal rather than panicked flight. Equipment had been destroyed rather than abandoned. Supplies had been burned. Defensive positions had been deliberately dismantled. Marines examining the site concluded that a substantial Japanese force had been at Tassafaronga recently and had withdrawn in good order. This suggested that despite the catastrophic condition of most Japanese forces, some units retained cohesion and combat effectiveness. February 1st brought the realization that began spreading through the advancing American units. The Japanese were gone. Patrols reached Cape Esperance on Guadalcanal's northwest tip and found positions that had been occupied by thousands of troops now completely empty. Beach areas that should have been defended showed signs of recent activity, but no Japanese soldiers. Marine commanders radioed back reports that made little sense. Enemy has vanished. No contact with Japanese forces. Positions abandoned. Intelligence officers examining all reports simultaneously began to understand what had happened. The Japanese hadn't been defeated in final battle, but had been evacuated. Those destroyer runs that American forces had been observing over the past weeks hadn't been reinforcing the Japanese garrison, but extracting it. The evacuation success represented one of the war's most skillful tactical operations, concealed within a strategic disaster. Japanese destroyers had conducted 3 major evacuation runs on February 1st, 4th, and 7th, extracting approximately 10,652 soldiers from Guadalcanal beaches under American observation without the Americans realizing what was happening. The deception had been perfect. American commanders believed they were witnessing reinforcement operations right up until Marines reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The irony was bitter. Japan had lost the campaign decisively, but had executed the evacuation flawlessly, saving a significant portion of their garrison that would have been lost if fighting continued. February 9th, 1943, brought the confirmation that ended the Guadalcanal campaign. General Patch radioed Admiral William Halsey, commanding South Pacific forces. Total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal effected today. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The message was simultaneously triumphant and anticlimactic. There had been no final dramatic battle, no Japanese surrender, no last desperate stand. The enemy had simply departed during the night, leaving behind their sick, their dying, and their dead. Marines who had fought for 6 months to hold Henderson Field found themselves in possession of the entire island without the climactic battle they'd expected. The statistics that emerged as the campaign ended told the story in numbers that barely captured the human cost. American casualties totaled approximately 7,100 killed and wounded from all causes, roughly split between combat and disease. Japanese casualties totaled approximately 31,000 dead or missing, with perhaps 10,600 evacuated, a survival rate of approximately 25%. Of the Japanese dead, fewer than one-third died in combat. The rest died from starvation, disease, and the systematic breakdown of logistics that transformed Guadalcanal into a death trap for Japanese forces. The campaign had been decided not by superior tactics or battlefield heroics, but by the grinding mathematics of logistics: tons of supplies delivered, calories consumed, reinforcements landed, casualties evacuated. For the Marines and soldiers who had fought on Guadalcanal, the campaign's end brought exhaustion rather than celebration. They had won, but winning had cost them months of their lives in jungle hell, had killed thousands of their comrades, and had broken their health in ways that would affect them permanently. Malaria would recur for years. Tropical diseases contracted on Guadalcanal would reappear decades later. The psychological scars from months of combat, bombardment, and privation would never fully heal. But they had accomplished something historically significant. They had stopped Japanese expansion. They had proved that American forces could defeat Japanese forces in sustained ground combat. They had established the pattern that would characterize the Pacific War. American industrial and logistical superiority would ultimately overcome Japanese tactical skill and individual courage. Guadalcanal was the turning point where America transitioned from desperate defense to sustained offense, and every Marine who served there would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. February 1st, 1943, midnight, Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal. Captain Masami Ban stood on the beach and counted destroyers materializing from the darkness, 20 warships approaching in single file, their wakes glowing with phosphorescence. Operation KE's first evacuation run was beginning, and Ban was responsible for embarking 2,000 soldiers in 90 minutes before dawn brought American aircraft. Behind him in the darkness, Japanese troops formed into columns, organized by their officers despite weeks of starvation and disease that left them barely able to stand. These were the survivors, soldiers strong enough to march to the embarkation beach, fortunate enough to be selected for the first evacuation run. They had survived Guadalcanal's hell, and now they would escape it if everything went perfectly. Ban checked his watch. 90 minutes to load 2,000 men onto destroyers while maintaining the fiction that these ships were delivering reinforcements rather than extracting the garrison. The deception had to hold for 3 more runs, or thousands would die trapped on beaches under American artillery fire. The operational planning that enabled Operation KE represented Japanese military competence applied to tactical retreat rather than offensive operations. Each destroyer had been modified to carry approximately 100 soldiers in addition to regular crew. Troops would board from landing barges that shuttled between beach and destroyers anchored offshore. The entire operation from destroyer arrival to departure would take no more than 90 minutes, long enough to embark troops, short enough to withdraw before dawn. 3 runs would be conducted, February 1st, 4th, and 7th. If everything succeeded, approximately 10,000 troops would be evacuated. The remaining 20,000, dead, dying, or too sick to march, would be left behind. It was a brutal calculation, but it was better than leaving everyone to die or be captured. The first evacuation proceeded with remarkable efficiency despite the desperate circumstances. Japanese soldiers waded into the surf and clambered aboard landing barges that ferried them to destroyers waiting in deeper water. Officers maintained discipline despite malnutrition and disease that left many soldiers barely conscious. The critically ill were carried aboard by comrades who were themselves weakened by starvation. Wounded were supported between 2 soldiers. Everyone understood that this was their only chance at survival. Miss this evacuation and die on Guadalcanal. By 1:30 a.m., 2,000 soldiers had been embarked. The destroyers turned north and accelerated to 30 knots, racing up the slot before dawn brought American aircraft. American forces observing the February 1st destroyer run interpreted it exactly as Japanese planners hoped. Coast watchers reported 20 Japanese destroyers approaching Guadalcanal, the largest Tokyo Express run in weeks. Henderson field aircraft were alerted but couldn't operate effectively in darkness. Marine artillery fired on suspected landing areas, but without observed targets, the fire was ineffective. By dawn, the destroyers were gone, racing north beyond aircraft range. American commanders concluded that Japan had reinforced Guadalcanal with approximately 2,000 fresh troops, when in fact, they had extracted 2,000 survivors. The deception was working perfectly. February 4th brought the second evacuation run with equal success. This time, American forces were expecting another reinforcement attempt and had positioned patrol boats offshore to interdict landing operations. The patrol boats detected destroyers approaching, but couldn't engage effectively against warships designed for surface combat. Japanese destroyers simply ignored the patrol boats and proceeded to evacuation beaches. Another 4,000 troops were embarked in 90 minutes and withdrawn before dawn. American aircraft attacked the withdrawing destroyers at first light, but scored no hits. The Japanese had now evacuated 6,000 troops in 2 runs, and American commanders still believed they were witnessing reinforcement operations rather than evacuation. February 7th brought the final evacuation run, and the most dangerous because American forces were now probing aggressively toward Cape Esperance. Marine patrols were operating within miles of the evacuation beaches. If a patrol stumbled upon the embarkation operation, they could call in artillery that would slaughter Japanese troops waiting on exposed beaches. Japanese commanders gambled that they could complete the operation before Marines realized what was happening. 20 destroyers approached Cape Esperance at 11 p.m. and began embarking the final 4,600 troops. These were the last survivors, soldiers who had been selected for evacuation and had somehow survived long enough to reach the beaches. Behind them in the jungle lay thousands who would never leave Guadalcanal. The embarkation proceeded with desperate urgency. Officers knew that every minute on the beach increased the risk of American discovery. Troops boarded landing barges as quickly as their weakened condition allowed. Some collapsed during boarding and had to be physically lifted aboard by crew members. Others waded into deeper water in their desperation to reach the barges, drowning when they lacked strength to swim. The scene was chaotic but organized, officers maintaining control even as their soldiers were literally dying around them. By 1 a.m., the last troops were aboard. The destroyers turned north and accelerated, leaving behind an island that had consumed a Japanese army. Dawn on February 8th brought Marine patrols to Cape Esperance, expecting to find substantial Japanese forces. Instead, they found empty bunkers, abandoned equipment, and a beach littered with debris from the evacuation, but no soldiers. Marines searched the area methodically, confused by the absence of resistance. Where had the Japanese gone? Had they withdrawn further inland? Slowly, as reports from multiple patrols came in, confirming that Japanese positions throughout western Guadalcanal were abandoned, the truth began to dawn. The Japanese hadn't reinforced their garrison during those destroyer runs. They had evacuated it. The enemy was gone. February 9th brought official confirmation when General Patch sent his message declaring Guadalcanal secure. But the real impact came in the statistics that intelligence officers compiled over subsequent weeks. Japanese forces had evacuated 10,652 soldiers from Guadalcanal in 3 destroyer runs conducted under American observation without American forces realizing evacuation was occurring. It was a tactical masterpiece that salvaged something from strategic disaster. Those 10,000 soldiers would fight again on other Pacific islands, but they represented barely 1/3 of the garrison that had attempted to hold Guadalcanal. The other 20,000, dead from combat, starvation, or disease, testified to the campaign's brutal cost. The final accounting of the Guadalcanal campaign revealed it as one of the most consequential battles of World War II. Japanese forces had committed over 30,000 troops, hundreds of aircraft, dozens of warships, and 6 months of sustained operations attempting to retake one airfield. They had failed completely. American forces had committed similar resources defending that airfield and had won decisively. More importantly, Guadalcanal established patterns that would define the Pacific War's remainder. American industrial superiority could sustain forces across thousands of miles of ocean. American defensive tactics could defeat Japanese offensive operations. American forces could learn and adapt while Japanese forces repeated failed tactics. The campaign demonstrated that Japan could not win a sustained war of attrition against American resources. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal exceeded even its strategic significance. For Japan, it was the first major defeat, the first admission that Japanese forces could be beaten in sustained combat, the first time the territory captured in the war's early months had been permanently lost. The myth of invincibility that Japanese propaganda had carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor was shattered. Japanese civilians reading about strategic redeployment from Guadalcanal understood they were being told about defeat, even if newspapers wouldn't use that word. For America, Guadalcanal proved that the long road back across the Pacific was possible. Marines and soldiers who had fought on that jungle island had demonstrated that American forces could match Japanese forces and win through superior logistics, firepower, and determination. The Marines who departed Guadalcanal in early 1943 left behind more than their dead comrades. They left their youth, their health, and any illusions about war's glory. They had learned that modern war was primarily about logistics and attrition rather than heroism and tactics. They had discovered that disease killed more effectively than bullets. They had endured conditions that should have broken them, but somehow didn't. Most had contracted malaria that would recur for the rest of their lives. Many had intestinal parasites and tropical diseases that would affect them permanently. All had psychological scars from months of combat stress, but they had won, and that victory meant everything. They had held Henderson Field when it seemed impossible. They had turned back Japanese offensives that should have overwhelmed them. They had survived Guadalcanal, and that survival meant they were now veterans who would carry the Pacific War forward to islands whose names they didn't yet know but would come to remember forever. Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Guadalcanal was the first step on that long, bloody road, and every Marine who served there understood they had participated in something historically significant. The battle where America stopped retreating and started advancing, the place where the tide turned and the path to Tokyo began.